Hey guys, thank you for stopping by the channel tonight. Today, I'm going to tell you a story not meant for the faint of heart about the instruments of torture and the punishments of winter, where humans were bound between frost, wind, and darkness. In that place, the cold didn't just kill flesh, it gnawed at the soul, turning prayers into frozen cries echoing through the ice. They say that on the coldest nights, if you listen long enough, you can still hear the chains clashing against the walls and the faint breathing of souls that were never set free. Before we begin this journey, don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so the channel can continue to grow and bring you more chilling tales from the Middle Ages where history and suffering intertwine. Now, turn off the lights, find yourself a comfortable place to lie down, pull up your blanket, and leave only the faint glow from your screen. Because when the story begins, you'll need every bit of warmth left in your room. That night, the wind swept through the valley like lost souls searching for their way home. Its howls struck the cliffs and echoed down the abandoned corridors, where, they say, if you listen long enough, you can hear chains clinking softly like someone groaning in their sleep. I stood before the heavy iron door, its surface coated in thick frost that cracked faintly each time the wind passed, sounding eerily like human bones breaking. It was my first night stepping into this place, the winter prison, the dungeon of forgotten souls. They say there are no flames here, no whips, only the cold, and it is that cold that punishes most cruelly. I held up the oil lamp, the small flame flickering in the draught, casting a sickly yellow light just bright enough to reveal the scars of time scratches, claw marks dug deep into the stone, and dark stains that could be blood, or just the shadow of memory. In the corner, a broken chain still clung to the wall by a rusted hook. I bent down and touched it. The chill shot straight into my bones, slowing my heartbeat. Then, somewhere far off, I heard a faint clinking, soft but clear. At first, I thought it was the wind. But no, it was rhythmic, deliberate. The sound of metal touching metal, distant, then closer, then gone again. I froze, inhaling sharply, my breath turning to pale mist. In that instant, I realized I was trembling not from fear, but from something else that filled the air. A sorrow so heavy it felt like ice pressing on every stone, every speck of dust. On the wall, I noticed ancient words carved faintly into the stone. I brought the lamp closer, squinting to read. "When the wind sings, do not answer." The words felt like both a warning and a prayer. I stepped back, but the wind blew again, this time carrying with it a whisper. Cold. So cold. I spun around, no one there, only the chain still swaying slightly. The flame in my lamp flickered wildly, bending in one direction, as though something unseen had just passed by. In that trembling light, I saw a shape at the end of the corridor, a faint figure standing motionless, head bowed, hair hanging over its face. I couldn't move. The wind rose, swirling frost from the floor. The figure slowly lifted its head, but where a face should have been was only a hollow void, deep and black. I stepped back, and the flame died. Darkness swallowed everything. I stood still, barely breathing. Behind me, the chains rattled again, closer this time. A gust of freezing air brushed my neck, carrying the smell of rust and decay. I turned, but saw nothing except the old door, now slightly open. I didn't remember it being open before. Beyond it, stone steps led down into pitch blackness. Each step was coated with a thin layer of white frost, slick as though something had crawled there. I relit my lamp. Its dim glow revealed handprints pressed into the walls, etched deep into the stone, each finger long, twisted, as if clawing for escape. I descended slowly. Each footstep echoed, bouncing off the walls, as though the prison itself was breathing with me. Halfway down, I found a skeleton still chained to the wall, the iron collar tight around its neck. Its bony hand was raised, pointing downward, not sure if as a warning or an invitation. I swallowed hard, hearing the sound echo down the stairwell, and kept going. The air grew colder, to the point where my breath seemed to freeze inside my chest. Below, I heard the steady dripping of water, each drop falling like a needle against my skin. When I reached the bottom, the light reflected off something, an enormous chain hanging in the middle of the chamber, its metal corroded but still glistening with blackened blood. I stepped closer and saw what lay beneath. Dozens of skeletons piled neatly together, arranged almost carefully, as if by unseen hands. Among them was a cracked iron helmet, still clinging to strands of hair and a thin sheet of ice. I bent down to touch it, and then the chain above me jerked tight, scraping the air, followed by a howl of wind so sharp it sounded like a scream. I looked up. The chain was shaking violently, each link clanging against the next, echoing across the stone chamber. Every sound felt alive, stretched, echoing like the cries of another world, long, haunting, and endless. In that moment, I knew the chains I heard that night weren't just metal. They were the voices of souls still bound here, trapped forever by a cold that would never melt, and by sins long forgotten by time. I stood still in the sound of chains clashing, each echo like the whisper of the dead. The wind grew stronger, lifting icy dust, and in that marrow-deep chill, I suddenly remembered the story. An old prison keeper once told me in a tavern by the road, the story of a place they called the Winter Prison. According to legend, it wasn't built to imprison people, but to imprison sin itself. There, the cold was the judge, and the ice was the final sentence. The old man said that once, the kingdom sought a more humane punishment, less blood, less screaming. So they built this prison, deep within the frozen mountains, where the sun appeared only 3 months a year. Every stone in its walls was carved with runes to preserve the cold, and every iron door was washed with melted snow. They believed that instead of killing, the cold would slowly draw the sinner's soul out of their flesh, forcing them to feel the weight of their crimes. But no one knew that the cold doesn't just punish sin, it devours what's left alive. I looked around, my breath turning thick with frost, blurring in the dim light of my dying oil lamp. Ahead of me stood a cracked stone tablet, carved with ancient words in a language I didn't recognize. Here, the fire dies, so the soul may see itself in ice. I read it again and again, the image rising in my mind of prisoners trapped without fire, without light, surrounded only by wind and frost. Some say that cold didn't come from the weather, but from a curse that the first man condemned here was a murderer who could not be burned, and so the god of justice used ice to punish him instead. But when he died, he cursed the place, vowing that everyone who entered would share his chill. The old storyteller's voice echoed in my memory, gravelly and low. No one dies of the cold, they die from hearing it. I hadn't understood that sentence until now. Inside the prison, I began to hear strange sounds, not human, but faint groans, stretching long, like wind threading through bone. They didn't come from any single place. They came from everywhere, echoing from within my own chest. I inhaled deeply, and in that breath, it felt as though I had swallowed hundreds of frozen voices. The sensation was heavy, deep, so cold it made my head spin. I wondered if this place had ever truly existed, or if it was born from mankind's imagination of a punishment too perfect for its sins. People like to believe that death by freezing is peaceful, no blood, no screaming, just an endless sleep in the frost. But no one mentions that before sleep comes the endless moments when skin splits, blood stills, and the mind stays awake long enough to feel every piece of the body falling apart. The wind screamed through the cracks in the wall, carrying a distorted laugh. I stepped back, and the flicker of my lamp cast shadows across the stone. On the wall were deep carvings, figures kneeling, arms spread wide, and above them a circular symbol split in two, like a sun cleaved apart. Beneath it, a faint inscription read, "No flame can save the soul in winter." I brushed my fingers across the words, and the ice under my touch cracked, splintering into thin, vein-like lines before melting away. Inside the ice, I saw something, a black mark, long and coiled like a strand of hair. But when I looked closer, I realized it was the imprint of a chain once encased in frost. Not a real chain, just the scar of something that had been there. I stepped back. The light flickered again, revealing footprints across the floor, faint but still wet. Someone had been here. I knelt, pressing my palm to the icy stone, and felt a subtle rhythm beneath it like a heartbeat. This prison wasn't dead. It was breathing. I inhaled, the cold slicing through my skull, and in the white mist of my breath, I heard a whisper from within the walls. "Welcome to the place where there is no fire, only the reflection of sin." The voice faded, leaving behind a lingering echo, like the end of a song without conclusion. The wind rose again, carrying the scent of iron and thawing ice, mingling with the faint clatter of chains. I looked deeper into the darkness, and for the first time, I understood why they say the cold in the winter prison doesn't kill. It makes you remember that you once lived. I kept walking, the light in my hand casting a faint yellow glow, flickering like a creature gasping for its last breath. The deeper I went, the thicker and colder the air became, as if every grain of dust in the dungeon had turned to ice. I could hear my own heartbeat slow, heavy blending with the distant dripping of water from somewhere below. Each drop echoed sharply, like the ticking of time for the souls trapped here. The walls on either side were coated with a thin layer of frost, slick like the skin of someone drenched in sweat. From time to time a gust of icy air would blow through, making the flames sway violently. When I touched the wall, its surface was so cold it stuck to my skin. I had to yank my hand back, leaving a streak of blood on the frozen stone. The blood froze instantly, darkening into a purplish stain, as if the rock itself had absorbed it. The stone chamber seemed endless. I passed turn after turn, each hallway longer and darker than the last. There were no windows, no wind, just a growing pressure that weighed on my chest, making my breath blur into mist. On the walls were strange carvings, faces distorted, hollow-eyed, mouths open as if in eternal screams. I held the lamp closer and realized each face was carved where cracks had once been. Perhaps that was where people had struck the walls with hammers to free the souls within? I wondered, but there was no answer. A faint hiss of wind echoed from somewhere far away, not strong enough to move the light, but cold enough to make my skin tighten. I pulled out my notebook and scribbled a few words, trying to remind myself this was still reality, not a fever dream. Stone chamber, white breath, echo alive, walls moaning. But as soon as I finished writing, the moan actually came long, strangled, and real. I froze. It wasn't coming from far away. It was right behind me. I turned. The lamp's light swung into the darkness, revealing a deep alcove. Inside stood something like a human-sized block of ice, shimmering grey under the dim glow. I stepped closer. The ice was so clear I could see what was inside a skeleton, still bound by chains around its neck and wrists, its head tilted slightly to one side. The front of the ice had cracks as if someone inside had once tried to knock their way out. I placed my hand on it. The cold stabbed deep, sharp enough to hurt. The moment my fingers touched it, there was a faint clink, like a response. I stepped back, heart pounding. In that instant, I saw the frost in the air swirl around the frozen block, then fade like smoke. A gust of cold brushed past, and I heard a whisper, soft, trembling, as if spoken from inside someone's chest. Still, cold. I couldn't react, because when I looked again, the ice was still silent, lifeless. I glanced around and realized I was standing in a circular chamber. The ceiling was domed, damp stone dripping condensation that fell onto my neck. At the center, the floor dipped down into a shallow groove that led to a dark pit. A thin stream of water ran through it, perhaps melted snow, or blood long frozen. I shone my lamp downward. The surface reflected dim light, but what lay beneath wasn't just water. Round, smooth, white-shaped skulls, dozens of them, some still bound by rusted wire around their necks. I swallowed hard. The air reeked of rust and rot, the metallic stench burning my throat. On the opposite wall was a small door, low enough that one would have to bow to pass through. It was made of oak, so old every grain of wood had splintered, but what stopped me was the carving on its surface, a snowflake pierced by 3 spears. Beneath it, etched deep, were the words, "Only when the heart stops will the wind rest." I pressed my ear to the door. Nothing. Then, faintly, a low murmur like hundreds of prayers whispered from a great distance. I took a breath and pushed the door open. Inside was a small, empty room, lit only by a weak blue light filtering through a crack in the ceiling. At its center stood a stone pedestal covered in frost, and on it what made me freeze, a statue. But it wasn't a statue. It was a person, frozen solid in a kneeling position, hands clasped, face locked in terror. His eyelids were half closed, lips slightly parted, as if still whispering something. Thin mist rose from his mouth, faint, but real. I stumbled back, my hand shaking. the lamp quivering so hard the light danced wildly across the wall behind him. And there, carved across the stone, were rows upon rows of strange markings. They looked like letters at first, but when I looked closer, I saw they were figures, bent bodies, twisted together, all bowing toward the frozen man. My chest tightened, breath caught. The air grew thick, almost solid. I dropped my notebook. The lamp flickered, casting its trembling light onto the ice covering the man's body. For one fleeting moment, I saw my own reflection in it, blurred, trembling, but unmistakably mine. The eyes staring back weren't his. They were mine. As if I were the one trapped inside the ice, waiting for someone to come and set me free. I was still frozen in front of that ice-bound figure when, from somewhere in the darkness, a blade of wind sliced across my neck, making the lamp in my hand flicker violently. Tiny flakes of snow began to fall from the cracks in the stone ceiling, light as dust, but so cold they stung my skin. I left the chamber, stepping deeper into another corridor where the floor was slick with a thin sheet of ice. My footsteps echoed, each one sounding like it landed on buried cries beneath the ground. The farther I went, the more distinct the clinking became, steady, rhythmic, like breathing. I stopped, tilting my head. It wasn't the wind, it was metal against metal. I raised the lamp toward the sound, and the light fell upon an old iron frame hanging from the ceiling. Chains dangled down, twisted together, and at the end of one hung a dark shape. I stepped closer. The smell hit first rust and frozen flesh. That shadow was a person, or rather, had once been one. The body was bare, the skin fused to the metal, patches of flesh frozen white streaked with cracks of red. A draft swept through, making the chain sway slightly, the body creaking with a grotesque sound that almost resembled laughter. I stepped back, looked up, and saw more chains above empty, except for fragments of bone still clinging to their hooks. Some chains glistened with dried blood, frozen into crystalline threads. When the lamp shook, the reflections scattered across the walls like shards of broken mirrors. I raised a hand to shield my eyes, then heard something sliding along the floor behind me, a wet, dragging sound. Something was moving. I turned, sweeping the light across the icy pillars, but saw nothing. Only a faint red streak trailing across the frozen floor, as if something or someone had just crawled by. I swallowed hard, inhaled, and felt the cold sear into my lungs. My breath turned to white fog, swirling around my face before melting into the heavy air. Ahead, I saw another doorway, a thin glow leaking through a narrow gap. I moved quickly, gripping the lamp tighter. As I approached, I realized the door wasn't wood. It was iron, heavy, bound in thick, rusted chains. When I touched it, the metal burned with cold. Etched into the surface was a strange symbol, a man hanging upside down, arms spread wide, a steel rod driven through his back. Beneath it, words carved deep into the iron read, "They will hang in the wind until the wind itself grows weary." I pushed gently. The door shrieked open, a long, echoing scream that raced down the hallway. A rush of icy air burst out, carrying with it the stench of corpses. Inside, dozens of bodies hung from the ceiling, wrapped in chains from head to toe. Some were suspended by the neck, others by their shoulders, but all were frozen solid, like massive pendulums frozen mid-swing. Each time the wind slipped through the cracks, they swayed faintly, their movement producing a sound that was part chain, part moan, a song so chilling it clenched my heart. I stepped toward one, tilting the lamp upward. The eyes of the hanging man were still open, the pupils gone, replaced by a dull, milky frost. His lips were cracked, his teeth bare beneath a thin crust of ice. Those eyes, they seemed to be looking down, following my every move. I took a step back, then realized the ice beneath my boots was fracturing, the cracking sound spreading outward. One of the bodies above began to shake, the chain clanging wildly before snapping. The body crashed to the ground, shattering like glass, sending shards of flesh and crimson ice flying. I screamed instinctively, but the sound died in my throat, replaced by ragged breaths. The lamp slipped from my hand and shattered, the flame dying instantly. Darkness swallowed everything. In that pitch-black void, I heard chains dragging, and something crawling across the ice, slow, heavy breathing. I groped blindly for the lamp, but my fingers brushed against something soft, cold, and wet. I jerked back, and in the brief flicker of dying oil, I saw it a human hand gripping my ankle, pale as snow, cracked and rimmed with frozen blood. I shouted, kicking hard. The hand slipped away, but from above, the other bodies began to tremble, chains clattering like a storm of metal, as if the entire room had awakened. I stumbled backward toward the door, gasping, mind spinning. The wind howled through the cracks again, this time carrying voices. Dozens, maybe hundreds, overlapping in whispers that made no sense. As I ran out, I looked back one last time. The bodies were still swaying, but some had fallen, crawling slowly toward the light. And as I fled, heart pounding, a deep, rasping voice rose behind me, cold as steel, whispering, "Don't touch the chains. They remember the warmth of human hands." I ran through the narrow corridor, my footsteps echoing off the cold stone walls like they were coming from another world. My breath came in ragged bursts, my chest burning hot while the air around me was so cold it felt like inhaling tiny blades of ice. Ahead, a pale light flickered from a torch on the wall, its flame trembling like a dying invitation. I stopped, trying to steady myself, and realized I was standing before a large chamber. The door was slightly open, and from inside, a thick chill poured out like smoke. I pushed gently. The hinges screamed a long, mournful cry. Inside, the air shimmered faintly, and in the center of the room stood something I had never seen before. A chair made entirely of steel, heavy, and glazed with a thick sheet of ice, glinting silver in the torchlight. Beneath it were small puddles, frozen, thawed, and frozen again, in a rhythm that felt disturbingly alive, as if the room itself were breathing. I stepped closer, my hand trembling as it touched the chair's surface, cold, smooth, hard as a mirror. But when I leaned in, I saw them indentations on the ice, shaped like hands and wrists, the marks of someone once bound there by iron straps. A line of words had been carved into the steel with a blade, faint but still readable. The ice chair for those who must learn silence. I pulled my hand back, feeling as if I'd just touched something still alive. In the corner was a wooden bucket turned upside down, beside a thin metal pipe that hung from the ceiling, dripping. Each drop of water fell straight onto the chair, clear, precise, relentless. I could see faint scratches on the surface, uneven, frantic as though someone had struggled, clawing for freedom in their final moments. A draft slid through the cracks in the wall, making the torchlight shiver, and I heard a sound barely audible, teeth chattering. It wasn't mine. It came from somewhere near the chair. The sound trembled, slowed, then faded. I stepped back, my eyes fixed on the steel frame, and saw a dark streak running down one leg of the chair. I crouched, lifting the light closer, and my stomach turned cold. It was blood, but not fresh. Dried long ago, preserved by ice, it glittered red beneath the firelight like strands of frozen glass. I knelt down, studying it carefully. The chair was centered in the room, a narrow channel carved beneath it to catch runoff, and around it were faint marks where shackles had once been. From above, a chain hung down with a small copper funnel at the end. Then it struck me the water from the ceiling flowed into the funnel, dropping onto the prisoner bound there, each drop freezing on contact, seeping into the skin, into the bone, until the body became one with the ice. No knives, no whips, just time. Hours later, they would become statues, breathing their last through frozen lungs, screaming through sealed throats, a masterpiece of quiet death. Beside the chair lay a small leather-bound book, its cover stiff with frost. I picked it up and opened it. The handwriting inside was jagged but clear. 7th day of the 12th winter. The 13th man stopped screaming. When I poured the last drop, he only looked at me and smiled. My fingers went numb. The book slipped from my hand, landing softly on the icy floor, and in that instant I heard it a low laugh, distant but sharp as breaking glass. I looked up. The torchlight rippled across the chair's frozen surface, and there, reflected beside me, was another shape. A shadow seated in the chair, its head tilted slightly, hair hanging forward. I stopped breathing, my heart pounding so loud it drowned the silence. The wind stirred again, and the shadow moved. I didn't dare look directly, but in the corner of my vision, I saw it lift its head. There was no face, only a pale blur where the light passed through. Then came a faint crack, crack, the sound of ice breaking. I turned to run, but the door behind me had already closed. The wind was gone now, the air thick, unmoving. Only the sound of dripping water remained steady, deliberate falling from the ceiling onto steel. I backed against the wall, fumbling blindly, my breath catching. Then, in one long, dreadful heartbeat, I heard it, a thin, cold exhale rising from the chair itself, carrying the stench of rust and frozen blood. It was the breath of something not yet gone, something waiting, sitting patiently through the endless winter, keeping the silence alive, until it was my turn to take the seat. That sound kept echoing in my head, a faint, drawn-out crackling, like flesh splitting in silence. I stood frozen before the ice chair, unable to tear my eyes away from the cold steel frame. In the dying torchlight, the layer of ice that coated it seemed to tighten, fracturing into hairline cracks like a spider's web. I could hear each dry snap, every sound piercing my ears and sinking straight into my chest. Then came the final crack, a sharp, brittle pop that froze the entire room in place. In that moment, I understood it was the sound of bone breaking, shrinking under the cold, shattering like glass. The echo bounced off the stone walls, fading, dissolving into the howl of wind down the corridor. Somewhere behind me, a hoarse voice murmured, "That is the music of sin." I spun around, no one was there. Only a shadow stretched across the wall, distorted and trembling, as if it were smiling. That voice hadn't come from any living thing, it belonged to this place, where even the breaking of bones became a kind of melody. I looked around and saw the stone walls carved with hundreds of marks, not letters, not symbols, just straight lines, each one etched deep, all ending at the same height, knee level. They had sat here, bound to this chair, so cold their hands no longer felt, yet still carving, still counting the moments before disappearing forever. The wind passed through, the torch went out, and for a while the room was swallowed in darkness. Only the faint shimmer of the ice reflected light back. I sank down, my back to the wall, feeling the stones seep into my bones. Everything was silent. No voices, no footsteps, only the brittle sound of cracks echoing from far away, one after another, like strings stretched to the point of snapping. Each vibration made me shiver. It wasn't random, it had rhythm. I listened carefully, realizing there was a melody, slow, steady, haunting, as though someone was playing an infernal symphony. The sound came from deeper within the prison, through frozen halls and icy walls. I rose, stepping carefully, the soles of my feet numb against the stone floor. At the end of the corridor stood a massive wooden door, its surface buried beneath thick frost that even light couldn't pierce. I brushed away the snow and saw 3 lines carved into it. "When bone sings, the soul shall rest. When blood freezes, sin shall cease. When breath fades, winter will end." I whispered the words aloud, my voice echoing through the emptiness, sounding like someone else's. I pushed the door open. A blast of icy air hit my face, blurring my vision. Inside was a vast chamber, the ceiling lost in mist. In the center hung a massive iron frame, suspended by 4 heavy chains. Within it a body, bound and frozen, its head bowed. The sound I'd followed was coming from here, from that body. Each time the ice cracked, a note rang out, resonating like a strangled instrument. I stepped closer, the cold pressed into my skin like 1,000 needles. When I reached the frame, the wind stopped, and I heard the real sound not cracking anymore but breathing. Faint, weak, alive. I looked up, his lips moved. No voice, only a thin puff of white mist escaping, dissolving instantly into the air. I leaned closer, hearing bones creak like old wood. His joints twitched, the chains clinking against the frame, creating a fragile, crystalline rhythm. In that moment, I understood why they called it the music of sin. Every prisoner bound here became a living note. Their body turned into an instrument for winter's execution song. Terror and sorrow knotted together in my chest, heavy and suffocating. When I turned, my shadow flickered on the wall, merging with the frozen one beside it, 2 figures, indistinguishable. The wind rose again, no longer howling but whispering, like a voice reciting forgotten confessions. And in that moment, I felt my name being called within that melody, a sound cold, drawn out, hollow, pulling me back toward the cracked ice chair, where the sentence of the cold had never truly ended. I left the room, my steps heavy, as though the cold itself was holding me back. The iron door closed slowly behind me, its hinges groaning like a sigh. Wind swept through the corridor, carrying strange echoes, part breathing, part weeping. I wondered how many had once been bound to that chair, how many souls had melted into mist, leaving behind those cracking sounds as a reminder of a punishment that never ends. After a few steps, I stopped. At the end of the corridor, there was a small hollow in the stone, and inside it, a faint bluish light shimmered like moonlight. My heart pounded as I moved closer, my hand gripping the torch as if it were the last living thing left in the dark. The closer I got, the clearer the whispering became, not wind, but voices. Each word was broken, trembling, as if escaping from frozen lips. I raised the torch toward the hollow, and in its flickering glow, I saw something that made my chest tighten. There, within a thick layer of ice, was the figure of a child. A small body, kneeling, hands clutching its head, hair matted across its forehead, eyes wide open, staring straight at me. The pupils were gone, only hollow sockets remained, reflecting the torchlight like mirrors. I stumbled back, my throat constricting. On the wall above its head, there were words carved by fingernail, jagged, desperate. He only stole a piece of bread. The letters were stretched, carved through agony. Beside the writing was a small handprint, the blood frozen, the claw mark still etched into the stone. I stood still, feeling as if the entire dungeon was watching me. The cold seeped into my flesh, like hundreds of invisible hands pressing against my skin, urging me to kneel, to lower myself to the child's level. The wind hissed, the torch flickered. For a second, I heard footsteps, soft, slow, but real. From behind me, from the dark corridor, the sound was coming closer. I turned, and the light revealed a shadowy figure of a man, tall, thin, cloaked in a dark hide coat, his hair crusted with frost. He didn't look at me. His eyes, hollow and red like dying embers, were fixed on the frozen child. He spoke in a hoarse, broken voice, each word scraped between his teeth. I remember him, the boy who stole the bread, and I couldn't save him. I said nothing. He stepped closer to the wall, touching the frozen surface, his fingers trembling. When they met the ice, a small crack rang out, and I saw pale blue light bloom from within the wall, spreading until the whole hollow glowed for a moment, then faded away. The old man sank to his knees, his back bent like dry wood. "We once believed the cold would teach people to repent," he said, his voice drifting like breath. But all I saw was that it taught them silence. I looked at him, a weight pressing in my chest. His face flickered in the torchlight, skin cracked, lips blue, eyes clouded. There was something in his gaze that chilled me. Not pain, but recognition, as though he had watched this happen 1,000 times before. "They said," he rasped, letting out a hollow laugh, "the cold is fairer than the blade because it kills slowly and kills equally." I wanted to ask who he was, but when I turned my head at the sound of the wind, he was gone. Only a faint imprint remained in the frost, where he had knelt, the mark of knees pressed into the ground for too long. I backed out of the hollow, the heaviness clinging to me like a shadow. When I looked back, the child's empty eyes still seemed to follow me. I walked faster, my breath thick, my heart clenched tight. Each step echoed through the corridor like a countdown. I didn't dare look back. But the whispers grew louder, not one, but many voices now. Men, women, children, all speaking broken phrases, tangled together. "Cold. Never ends. Please don't." I was surrounded by them. Their whispers filled my ears, my head, my breath. I ran. The wind roared with me, and through the chaos I heard the man's voice again, distant, hollow. "The cold is fairer than the blade." But beneath that echo came another, younger, weaker, the child's voice from within the ice. "But fairness doesn't make anyone warm." The corridor gradually opened into another space wider, with a higher ceiling, but so cold the air itself felt heavy, like lead. Inside, the torchlight flickered across rows of chains hanging from the walls. Each rusted iron loop eaten deep into the stone, covered with a thin layer of frost like dead skin. In the center of the room, a figure sat motionless on the floor, back against a stone pillar, head bowed, hair frozen to his face. In front of him lay an old scroll, unrolled across a patch of frozen water. He wore a short, torn cuirass, the sleeves ripped away, exposing bare arms turned purple-blue, veins bulging beneath cracked skin. When the torchlight touched his face, dark scars ran down both cheeks, like burns. He was still alive, his shoulders trembled slightly, his breath forming pale white mist. He opened his mouth, voice hoarse from the cold. "Do you hear it? The cold. It speaks to me." He laughed softly, teeth clattering together. "It's fair. It kills everyone the same, slowly, evenly, without remorse." His voice fell to the stone floor and shattered, fading. His eyes stared blankly into the darkness where the light could not reach, and he continued, almost whispering, "Blades can strike the wrong man, but the cold never does. A blade is anger, but the cold is judgment." His lips moved as if in conversation with himself. On the scroll before him were lines carved with a shard of steel, shaky, uneven, but deeply unsettling. "The cold is fairer than the blade, for it needs no reason to kill." Beneath it, in smaller script, "Those executed by frost shall be preserved until their souls confess their guilt." The air thickened with the smell of rust and melting ice. A draught seeped through the ceiling crack, snuffing out the torch in my hand, leaving only the faint blue light reflecting from the frozen walls. Everything fell into a silence so heavy I could hear my own heartbeat, the slow pulse of blood inside my ears. The man shivered, reaching out a trembling hand to touch the frozen ground. His voice rasped like a blade scraping stone. "I was once an executioner. My hands knew blood, knew screams. Then the king ordered me to try something new, a punishment of cold. They said it was less cruel." He lifted his head, eyes cloudy, reflecting the dim light like frozen tears. "But you know, when I saw them bound in ice, when I heard their skin crack and their blood freeze in their veins, I realized the blade was never frightening. The blade ends everything. The cold keeps it going forever." He laughed, a dry, brittle sound, like gravel rolling on stone. I stopped using my hands, but the cold didn't stop. It doesn't need me anymore. A droplet fell from the ceiling, breaking upon the scroll, spreading through the carved letters. The man stared at it, transfixed. I once begged the king to stop, told him we were creating statues that could still weep, but he only said, "This is justice. The cold does not take sides." His head tilted, gaze distant. I still hear them scream, even when there's no sound. The cold makes people mute, but it never makes them silent. His fist clenched, joints cracking audibly. "Fairness? No. The cold isn't fair. It just waits." Another gust of wind swept through, and the light fell on his face more clearly. The skin around his neck began to crack, flakes dropping away to reveal the white frost beneath. He remained there, calm, lips parting, breath faint but steady. "It's here," he whispered. "It's taking it all back." The ice beneath him began to spread, creeping up his legs, over his thighs, crawling across the armor, climbing toward his throat. He didn't resist. He sat still, eyes closed, lips moving as if reciting a nameless prayer. When the ice reached his mouth, the only sound left was the wind, soft, drawn out, steady like his breath dissolving into the air. Through the clear surface of the ice, his face remained perfectly preserved, eerily serene, lips still curved in a faint smile, eyes half closed as though freed at last. Farther away, in the corner of the room, a small drop of blood fell and froze upon the stone floor. From deep within the walls, a faint sound arose, indistinct, like hundreds of voices merging into one. The old souls still whispering that the cold is not fair, but it has never been wrong in taking life. The light from the remaining torch flickered against the ice, casting trembling reflections on the walls like wandering souls fluttering between two worlds. The cold was no longer just winter's chill, it felt alive, breathing, stalking each of my steps. At the end of the corridor stood a heavy door, bound by 3 layers of thick iron chains, all sealed under frozen ice. Across the steel surface were long scratch marks made by human nails, each groove oozing a thin line of darkened blood. Beneath the door, The ground dipped into a shallow trench filled with black ice crystals like frozen ashes. When I pushed gently, the door shifted only an inch, just enough for the cold within to escape, stabbing into my chest like knives of frost. On the other side came the sound of metal grinding against metal, slow, steady, and deep the weary sigh of iron itself. Then, through the misty haze, a dim shape emerged. A man bound to a chair, his entire body encased in a thick shell of ice. His face was frozen in a mix of fear and resignation. His eyelids were half closed, but in the torchlight, it seemed as though they still followed me. Above his head hung an iron funnel connected to a copper pipe reaching up to the ceiling, where droplets of water fell, one by one, onto his skull. Each drop landed with a faint tack, blending into the rhythm of the ice, cracking like the ticking of time toward death. The frost had already swallowed his neck, crawled over his shoulders, and covered half his chest. Only his hands were left exposed, bony, purple, trembling weakly. Each time he tried to move, his skin tore against the ice, revealing dark red beneath. The cold had sunk deep into his bones. Then came a faint groan, barely a sound, just the wind breaking inside a dying throat. He was still alive. His breath escaped in a thin, wavering mist. In his eyes, a dim spark flickered, then died. His frozen lips parted, and a voice slipped through, brittle and broken. "Kill me." The wind devoured half the words. Another drop fell, then another, and another slow, merciless. The water slid down his hair, freezing the instant it touched skin, forming layer after layer, like a crown of agony. His back was chained to the chair, iron links biting deep into his flesh. Blood seeped out, not red but dark violet, thick as syrup. He tried to turn his head, his eyes rolling toward the faint light, but his strength was gone. Every breath was a battle, and the cold was winning. On the wall beside him were crude markings, not letters, but rows of nail gouges running down the stone, counting the final seconds of life. Dried blood clung to each mark, some frozen solid into glassy streaks. Between them, a single phrase stood out, scratched deeper than the rest. "I beg to die, but the cold does not listen." Everything in the room seemed to freeze along with him. The wind howled through the cracks, whistling across the chains, its echo stretching out like the last cry of the dying. The torchlight danced across the ice, twisting his face, half smiling, half screaming. Then, suddenly, the ice around his neck split with a sharp crack. His whole body jolted. The chair rattled violently. Metal clanged against stone as shards of ice shattered and scattered like the chime of 1,000 dead bells. A wave of cold surged outward, as though a soul had just escaped. Inside the ice, I saw a faint shimmer, a thin thread of light rising with the mist before fading into the air. On his face appeared a faint smile, not of pain or fear, but of sheer exhaustion. The chains around his chest creaked and loosened, one by one, falling to the ground with dull metallic clatters, as if the dungeon itself exhaled its final breath. The copper pipe above stopped dripping. Silence filled the chamber, broken only by the soft sound of melting ice. Where the man sat, faint words appeared on the surface, not carved, but traced in vapor. "I beg to die faster." The torch flared once, then died completely, and in that absolute darkness, the wind rose again, no longer howling, but whispering something long, low, and cold, a lullaby sung by the condemned, echoing through a winter that has never ended. The space beyond the iron door slowly closed behind me, and the corridor ahead descended deeper, colder. The smell of rusted metal, damp stone, and something strangely sweet mingled together, heavy, as if this place had swallowed hundreds of human breaths. The torch in my hand flickered, its light stretching across the stone walls, revealing eerie marks, faint carvings, not letters but frozen human faces, their eyes wide open as if staring directly at anyone who passed. They seemed trapped within the walls, half buried, half emerging, their flesh fused with ice. Each time the flame trembled, the light slid across their eyes, making them seem alive again, cold, wet gazes, silent yet filled with resentment. In the middle of the corridor, the stone floor dipped slightly, covered in a thick sheet of ice that reflected the torchlight into distorted shards. As I stepped on it, sharp, cracking sounds echoed everywhere, resonating deep below the ground. Beneath that ice, something dark shifted slow, shapeless, like a shadow crawling. A faint crack rang out, thin and sharp, and cold air burst from the fissure. The ice began to exhale, as though it was breathing. Beneath it, the shadows stirred. And then I saw them figures, dozens, maybe hundreds of bodies piled atop one another. Their skin fused to the ice, limbs twisted, faces pale and frozen in mid-scream. Some still had their eyes glassy, translucent, staring blankly. One corpse was still bound by chains around its neck, its head pulled to the side, mouth open in a grotesque grin, teeth sunk into the frozen floor. The cold shot straight to my heart, numbing every nerve. The air was thick, heavy as lead. At the end of the corridor, a faint light glowed through a cracked door. Pale blue, not warm, but damp and cold, like moonlight through water. From that gap came a voice neither male nor female, hoarse, thin, and wrapped in mist. "Do you see it now? The ice keeps the shape, but not the soul." The words didn't echo. They came from the walls themselves. As I approached, the door creaked open fully, revealing a round chamber with a high ceiling, lit by massive pillars of ice standing upright along the edges. Inside each pillar was a frozen human form. Each block reflected a different face. Men, women, old, young, all bearing the same expression. Eyes wide, mouths open in eternal screams, frozen in silence. Some blocks had cracks splitting through the chest, blood still red inside, frozen into intricate patterns like veins of marble. In the center of the room stood a round stone altar. On it lay a black leather book sealed in ice. I used my knife to pry it open, the brittle ice snapping with a dry crack. Inside were small, trembling lines of handwriting, words written by hands gone numb. Day 25. I was ordered to clean the room of the preserved bodies. They do not melt, not even after 7 winters. They lie there, still, as if asleep. But each night, I hear something, the sound of cracking, of breathing, and of someone calling my name. I turn the page. One of them opened his eyes. I saw it. He looked at me, and his lips moved. I couldn't hear, but I saw him mouth the words, "I'm still here." The next page was torn, the sentence cut off mid-line, the ink smeared with dried blood. Beside the book sat a small stone statue of a kneeling figure, hands covering its face. The statue's head had broken off and lay next to the altar. When I bent down, I realized the head wasn't stone at all. It was a real human skull, thinly coated with ice. The moment I touched it, the ice shattered, and in that instant, the air in the room changed. The cold seemed to retreat, leaving behind a heavy emptiness. Then the sound came again, the cracking of ice, this time from all around, loud and growing. Fractures spread through every frozen pillar like veins of breaking bone coming to life. The light inside the ice flared blue, white, then red. Each frozen face began to move slightly, heads tilting, eyes rolling, mouths opening. There was no sound, but I could feel their screams not in the air, but inside my skull, a chorus of pain without words. The scent of frozen blood and rust filled the air, thick enough to burn my throat. The room grew heavier, harder to breathe. Underfoot, the stone floor cracked, shards of ice rising like something trying to crawl free. I stumbled backward as the light pulsed dark, then bright again. Each flash broke another piece of ice. For one fleeting moment, I saw clearly a figure encased right in front of me, a man wearing the armor of an old kingdom, his eyes open, his head tilted, his lips faintly curved. Inside the ice, he was smiling. The cracking rose into a roar, the ceiling trembled, shards fell and shattered, echoing like a death bell, announcing that something had awakened. Then, silence, perfect, complete. Only the soft drip of melting ice remained. The sound of water slid down the cracks in the floor, seeping into the stone, as though this place was slowly swallowing back everything it had just brought to life. The sound of dripping water echoed through the vast chamber, each drop falling like the ticking of time for souls still imprisoned. The torchlight shimmered against the ice, casting flickering reflections on the ceiling like hundreds of cold eyes watching from above. In the center of the room, where the stone floor sank into a shallow pit, stood a massive iron ring. On its steel frame clung fragments of white bone and streaks of blood turned black, fused to the joints like burnt skin. That ring had once been an instrument of execution, a breaking wheel, where victims were bound, their limbs stretched and twisted until the bones tore apart. But here, the winter had added a new layer to the punishment. The melted snow dripping from the ceiling touched the metal frame, freezing again in an instant. Every time the wind slid through the cracks of the dungeon, the wheel trembled slightly, emitting a deep, mournful groan that sounded eerily human. Up close, one could hear the metal contracting under the cold, a faint cracking sound like the splintering of bones beneath their own weight. In the center of the wheel, a human figure was still trapped within the ice. His body was contorted, his left arm stretched until it deformed, the shoulder dislocated, the right leg twisted and frozen in an unnatural angle. His face was half visible beneath the frost, eyes wide open, and in their sockets sat two round chunks of ice reflecting the torchlight gleaming like the eyes of a beast. His mouth hung open, toothless, revealing dark, hollow gaps that looked like bottomless pits. Behind him, jagged spires of ice jutted up from the ground, piercing through his back, holding him upright in eternal posture. At the base of the wheel, the ground shimmered with a deep red hue. The blood there did not flow, it had crystallized, transparent enough to see the veins of stone beneath it. When the wind blew through, the frozen crystals struck one another, creating a brittle, shattering sound like breaking glass. Etched deep into the steel frame were words not carved by hand, but sliced by a blade. The wind is witness to every verdict. Below it, another line had been scrawled in shaky strokes, written perhaps by a frozen finger. The blood froze before the pain began. The cold in that chamber felt alive, creeping quietly up my neck, into my ears, making my skin prickle, as if whispered upon by unseen mouths. A faint noise came from the corner, something rolling across the stone floor, soft yet clear. The torchlight flickered, revealing a small marble of ice, perfectly clear like glass, and inside it, something moved. As I bent down, I saw what it was, a fly, frozen mid-motion, its wings spread wide as if still struggling to escape. A chill surged down my spine. Suddenly, a gust of wind burst in, and the wheel shifted slightly, groaning with a piercing metallic wail that tore through the air, a sound like someone screaming between life and death. With each slow rotation, white mist rose from the frozen body, curling through the room, drifting up toward the ceiling before condensing again into droplets that fell, restarting the cycle of endless execution. From far away, within the sound of the wind, came a voice low, hoarse, impossible to tell if it belonged to man or ghost. The wheel turns not to kill, but to remember. The voice echoed, resonating through the walls as though 100 throats spoke at once. The wind keeps confession, the ice keeps pain, man keeps silence. A current of cold seeped out from the steel frame, sliding around my wrists until my fingers went numb. The torchlight shrank, flickering weakly, and within that dimness, the frozen figure in the wheel trembled slightly. It wasn't the wind. A thin crack appeared across the ice covering his neck, crawling downward toward his shoulder. A sharp crack split the silence, and I saw the thin ice film over his eyelids twitch. In the stuttering light, his eyes seemed to shift just slightly toward the flame. Perhaps it was only illusion, but then the wheel turned another half rotation, slow and deliberate, as if pushed by an invisible hand. Each joint groaned, echoing through the chamber. The air thickened with the mingling scents of rust, blood, and cold dense enough to choke on. When the wheel finally stopped, a single drop of water fell from the ceiling, landing squarely on the frozen man's lips. The drop melted, slid down his chin, and then, on his face, appeared the faintest curve of a smile. Cold, twisted, a smile like an invitation to the next sentence in this endless trial. Outside the chamber of the wheel, the wind rose in waves, howling through the cracks in the walls like a long, drawn-out moan. In the brief pauses between each gust came another sound crows. Through the swirling fog, they appeared black shapes with eyes that glowed like embers, perched along the cracked stone corridor. Each bird's feathers were slick and heavy with wet snow, streaked with dried blood clinging around their beaks. In the center of the narrow courtyard stood a figure tied to a post. No armor, no cloak, only shreds of cloth clinging to his body. His flesh had turned dark purple, the skin split open like drought-cracked earth. Every gust of wind made his body tremble, flaking off dry skin to reveal the bluish muscle beneath. Above his head, a swarm of crows fought for space. Some pecked at his hands, others tore at his eyes, while one buried its beak deep into his open mouth. The air filled with the sound of tearing flesh, wing beats, and sharp cries, thick with a metallic stench and the chill of death. The wind blew relentlessly, carrying with it flakes of white frost swirling like ashes. Blood no longer flowed from the body on the post, but dark red veins had frozen down its length, forming dry, root-like patterns wrapping around him. The snow beneath was no longer white. It had turned a deep, ashen grey. Every step closer crunched through the frozen crust, and each fragment gave off a faint, rotting odour. A sudden gust scattered the crows into a frenzy, their wings beating wildly as they took off, revealing the face of the man bound to the post. Half his face was gone, ripped away, leaving one eye wide open, the other a hollow pit. His mouth was frozen open in a silent scream. His lips were purple, his chin crusted with ice, and his teeth glimmered faintly with frozen blood. Around his neck hung a wooden board, crudely carved with a knife. Crime. Cannibalism. Beneath it, smaller words read, "Saved himself in the night of hunger," but was not allowed. A stronger gust swept through, shaking the post, and from the man's mouth a shard of ice fell, shattering on the stone floor. The sound echoed like a sigh, bouncing off the walls, followed by the chaotic screams of crows, and then silence. From the eastern wall, a faint blue light flickered, reflecting off broken shields, remnants of a long-dead guard. Scattered across the ground were skeletons still clad in tattered armour, hands clutching spears, feet in iron boots, their bodies gnawed to bone by frost. Some still hung by half-broken chains, swaying in the wind like pendulums of death. A crow swooped down and perched on one skeleton's shoulder, tilting its head before letting out a harsh, rasping caw, a sound eerily human. The flock followed, diving down to peck at the ice-covered remains, beaks striking metal with a metallic clatter. Underfoot, a brittle crackling filled the air, not snow, but bone fragments breaking apart. Fingers, kneecaps, bits of skull lay embedded in the ice, shattering under every step. The cold was so intense that the blood on my hands crystallized into tiny grains, like sand. Then, from afar, a bell tolled low, dry and short. Another followed, longer, deeper, mournful. The sound had no clear source, as if it rose from beneath the ground itself. With each toll, the wind surged again, and the hanging corpses along the walls trembled. One skull fell, rolling across the stone until it stopped, the frozen eyes still staring toward the sound. In the courtyard, the snow began to swirl. The wind gathered into a spiral, carrying dust, feathers, and crow down into a chaotic dance. The post tilted, the chain around the man's neck strained, gave a sharp metallic snap and broke. His body crashed to the ground, shattering partly on impact, scattering chunks of ice and flesh across the stones. At that moment, the bell went silent. The wind ceased. The crows withdrew but did not flee far. They perched in rows along the roof, all facing the same direction toward the spreading glow of blue light along the ice wall. The light grew stronger, illuminating every bloodstain on the snow, coating the courtyard in a silver, ghostly hue. From within the light, shapes began to emerge, faint, half-transparent figures sculpted from mist. They moved slowly, leaving no footprints, gliding across the stone, passing through corpses as if through air. Their eyes were empty, unfocused, fixed on nothing, as they walked in lines, in ranks as though still patrolling, still keeping their post long after winter had claimed them. One of them stopped by the fallen post, crouched beside the shattered body, and gently reached out a hand of ice. The moment that cold finger touched the corpse's head, the remains dissolved, blending into the snow and vanishing without trace. And in that instant, the wind rose again, carrying with it the frantic cries of crows scattering into the dark, as though every living thing had just witnessed something forbidden, too terrible to name. I stepped through the door into the open, and the wind struck my face like blades of ice. The sharp, metallic scent of blood, mixed with the cold air, burned my throat dry. Before me stretched a wide courtyard, bare and blindingly white. Snow covered everything, but in the centre, the ground was stained with dark patches, remnants of old fires. places where executions had once taken place. Far ahead, on the high stone wall, dozens of bodies hung from chains, swaying in the wind, their tattered cloaks flapping, bare feet frozen stiff, skin fused with snow like wax figures. Flocks of black crows circled above, cawing harshly, sometimes diving down to tear at the scraps of flesh still clinging to bone. One landed right on my shoulder, tilting its head to watch me. Its eyes reflected a cold blue light, and for an instant I could have sworn I saw a human face in their depths. I flung my arm sharply, and it flew off, leaving behind a small streak of blood on my coat. The sun was a pale blur behind thick mist, its faint light gliding across the ice pillars sprouting from the ground, illuminating the hanging shadows on the wall. The wind screamed through, and the chains clanged together, their echoes mingling with the crows' cries, a chaotic symphony of decay. I stepped closer, each stride heavy, my iron boots sinking into the snow. As I approached, I realized not all of them were dead. One figure still moved barely, just a faint twitch of the fingers. I froze, staring upward. It was a man, thin, almost naked, his body draped in little more than torn rags. His skin was ghostly pale, nearly translucent, the veins beneath shining a deep blue. Every gust of wind made the thin layer of frost on his flesh quiver, catching the dim light. I heard teeth chattering, then a hoarse whisper escaping his throat. "Please, don't." His voice broke apart, swallowed by the wind. I lifted my gaze, his lips trembled, blue and cracked, but his eyes couldn't open. Only faint movement pulsed beneath the frozen lids. He was still alive. I didn't know how or why, but the cold hadn't killed him. It had trapped him instead, suspending him between life and death, like some cruel joke of nature. The wind rose again, and from afar came answering sounds, not the wind this time, but the groan of chains being pulled. I turned, and horror gripped me when I saw it wasn't just him. The others, all those hanging along the wall, were moving too. Some lifted their heads, others swayed, eyes half open, their milky pupils blank yet still fixed downward. I stumbled back, a shiver racing up my spine. I could feel their gazes, dozens of them watching. The snow beneath my boots cracked sharply. The faint, rotten stench buried in the ice began to seep out, blending with the cold into something indescribable, sweet, foul, ancient, like the smell of death that still clung to warmth. A crow swooped down, landing right on the living man's shoulder. It bent forward and pecked at the skin near his neck. He convulsed violently, letting out a long, rasping moan as his hand clenched the air. I started to move toward him, but a sudden gust hit me hard, nearly knocking me over. When I looked up again, the crow was gone, carrying with it a strip of frozen flesh. The man was still trembling, his mouth open wide, but no sound came out. I turned my torch toward the walls and saw strange markings carved into the stone, straight lines, crosses, circles like some coded language. Beneath each symbol was a name. Some had been buried under frost, but a few were still legible. Elric, Tobus, Kale. The names meant nothing to me, yet every time I read one silently, the wind seemed to howl louder. As if answering, I whispered one, just once. Elric. Instantly, from the opposite wall came the metallic clatter of chains, followed by the crack of something breaking. I lifted the torch, its light sweeping across the stone. One of the hanging bodies was moving. Its arm jerked, the chain went taut, then loosened. A metallic clang rang out, echoing through the courtyard. Then another body twitched, then another. The sound of shifting chains spread in every direction. I stepped back quickly, torch shaking in my hand. Above, dozens of corpses swayed together, knocking into each other, their chains clanking like mad laughter. The snow thickened, the wind howled harder, tossing my hair back. Amid the chaos, a voice rose quiet, but clear. You spoke their names. I spun around, but there was no one. Only wind and the dangling dead. The voice came again, closer this time, right beside my ear. Don't speak the names of the dead before the wind stops. My breathing quickened, heart pounding, the chill seeping deep into my veins like water. Suddenly, one of the bodies fell from above. It hit the ground with a heavy thud, ice shattering and spraying across my face. I raised the torch, his face was still intact, eyes wide open, staring straight at me. He lay on his side, one hand clenched tight around something. Between his fingers, a piece of paper was frozen solid. I pried it loose, and there, scrawled in trembling handwriting, were the words, "We are not dead. We are kept." The wind screamed in fury, and all at once, a chorus of moans filled the courtyard low, trembling, endless the breath of souls trapped in ice. I turned and ran. Snow shattered beneath my boots, the torch flickering wildly. Behind me, the chains began to rattle again, the flapping of wings and the howling of wind blending into one a dirge for those the cold refused to let die, waiting only for some fool to call their names in the dark. From the far end of the courtyard, where the wind hissed through cracks in the stone like a dying breath, a narrow passage appeared, leading upward. The stone steps were slick with moss and ice, marked by deep footprints, traces of those who once climbed but never returned. On both sides, the walls rose high and broken, revealing dark hollows hidden within. Something glimmered faintly in that darkness, small, pale green lights, flickering like eyes watching an intruder. At the top, the space opened wide, and the wind struck with such force it nearly tore my cloak apart. In the centre hung a massive iron cage, suspended by 4 thick chains descending from the stone ceiling. The cage swayed slowly with the wind, creaking with a sound that chilled the air itself. Inside, it was a man, or what was left of one. The body was shriveled and dry, the skin cracked like burnt bark, crusted with frost. 2 bony hands clutched the bars tightly, head tilted upward, mouth open wide as if frozen mid-scream, but no sound came out. The wind howled through the bars, weaving its way between the iron ribs, producing a mournful hollow wail like cries shredded by a blizzard. The snow had frozen thick around the cage, but each time it turned, the reflected light shimmered on the icy surface of the figure's face, making it flicker alive, then dead, then alive again. Each gust sent the cage trembling, ringing out a chorus of metallic cries blending with the howling wind, forming a haunting melody that seemed to last forever. Beneath the cage, the frozen ground was scarred with pale circular marks, faint rings of death, etched into the ice over centuries. In the centre of each ring was a small hollow, the spot where drops of melted frost had fallen, one after another, through countless years. In the corner of the wall, a torn piece of cloth clung to the stone, embroidered in black thread. The wind will not stop until I stop trembling. The stitches were jagged and uneven, as if sewn by a hand stiff with frost, yet each needle had pierced deep, leaving dried bloodstains across the fabric. The wind roared harder, making the cage slam against the wall clang, clang, each strike echoing through the vast chamber, merging with the wail of the storm until it sounded like a choir of trapped souls. A metallic tang filled the air, sharp enough to sting the lungs. Beneath the mist, I could see small chunks of ice scattered across the ground, shaped like human hands, fingers curled tight, as if reaching for a light they could never touch. Suddenly, a flash of lightning burst outside the cavern mouth, its glow reflecting off the wall behind the cage, revealing a line of words carved deep into the stone. They hung me so the wind would remember I once breathed. Each letter looked as though it had bled, etched by fingers scraped raw. Beneath the ice, the ground began to tremble softly, cracking with sounds fine and sharp as blades. From the fissures rose a thick breath of frost, coiling upward around the iron cage. The chains rattled, the cage swayed faster, the wind screamed, and metal clashed, like church bells struck without mercy. Amid the storm, the figure inside moved. Frozen hair cracked and fell away, scattering like shards of glass. One finger twitched barely, but enough to send a shower of frost cascading down to the floor. The cage spun, turning fully to face the wind. At that moment, lightning struck again, revealing the figure's face in stark light, hollow eyes without pupils, deep as pits of ice. His lips parted, and a broken, rasping sound escaped. Cold never dies. As the final word faded, the wind surged, spiraling violently around the cage. The 4 chains screamed, vibrating as if about to snap, clanging together in a desperate metallic song. Ice melted and refroze within seconds, time itself losing rhythm in this cursed place. The shards that fell shattered across the floor, and from each fragment rose faint silhouettes, half human, half smoke, drifting slowly around the cage. Every gust of wind tore them apart, but they reformed again, endlessly repeating their frozen cycle. The wind swept through the cavern one last time, snuffing out my torch. In the darkness, only the sound of iron remained steady, cold, echoing the pulse of something that still refused to let go of its eternal punishment. When the wind stopped suddenly, silence fell like a heavy cloth covering the entire space. Only the faint drip of metal from the iron cage remained slow, steady, and cold enough to seep into the skin. In the far corner of the chamber, where the dim light could not reach, a small candle flickered, nearly extinguished. Its trembling flame revealed the figure of a man sitting on the floor. A long robe, a hood drawn over his head, and in his hands, an old book. The wind brushed past, making the flame waver and casting light across the sunken face of an old priest. His eyes were hollow, fixed on some invisible point that no longer belonged to this world. Before him stood a small crucifix made of ice brittle, cracked, and held together by twisted wire. He knelt before it, hands trembling, clutching a rosary also carved from ice. Each bead clicked together softly, ting, ting, a fragile sound on the edge of breaking. He began to pray, his voice hoarse and fractured between each word. "Lord, if you see this place, grant them rest. But if you do not, then please, do not let this winter end." The last words caught in his throat. A single tear rolled down his cheek, but it was not warm, it froze mid-air, glimmering like a tiny gem, before striking the stone floor and shattering. He lifted his gaze, lips trembling. "Do you know, Lord," he whispered, "I once believed this place was justice. I watched so many sinners die without forgiveness. But last night..." His voice faltered, hand gripping the frozen rosary tighter. "Last night, I saw them smile. They smiled inside the ice, as if to say even you had forsaken them." He laughed, a harsh, broken sound that cracked and died in the air. A gust swept through, stirring his robe and revealing a dark, circular mark on his neck, the imprint of a noose long ago. Beside him, the book lay open, its pages warped and stiff, streaked with frozen droplets. Across one page, written in dried blood, were the words, "I heard their prayers as they died, and the sound did not rise to heaven, it sank into the ice." The wind shrieked again, snuffing out the candle. Darkness swallowed the room whole. Only the faint light reflected from the ice crucifix remained, casting ghostly shadows across the priest's face. He still knelt, but now his eyes were wide open, unblinking. His lips parted not to pray, but to release a sound that was no longer human. A long guttural moan escaped, trembling, low, as if pulled from deep inside his chest. Each breath turned to white mist, coiling around his head, spiraling upward in twisting trails. The air grew heavy, dense, pressing down until every moan echoed in multiple directions, as if hundreds of voices were praying at once. On the wall behind him, frost spread rapidly, the swirling mist taking shape, faces forming in the ice, eyes, mouths, distorted and fading away. Each time one vanished, another appeared, and with each one, his voice grew weaker, raspier, but still continued, unbroken. The wind and the prayer merged into one endless hum, indistinguishable from each other, man and storm, sinner and God, all the same. Then suddenly, the crucifix flickered with light. A thin crack split down its center, branching out like veins across glass. From within the ice, a faint glow emerged, weak but unmistakable. It wasn't white, it was red, like a buried coal. The priest saw it, and a trembling smile spread across his face. "At last," he gasped. "You've heard me, haven't you?" But the hope lasted only a heartbeat. From the crack burst a plume of thick black smoke, heavy, coiling, dense, filling the air with the stench of burning flesh and charred prayers. It wrapped around him, seeping into his hair, his skin. The priest coughed violently, clutching the melting crucifix. The ice had turned to black liquid, sticky and foul. From within the smoke came voices, faint, broken, unmistakably human. "Who do you pray for, priest? Them or yourself? Whose soul do you beg to save, yours or theirs?" "Cold is fair. because it listens to no one. The voices overlapped, rising into a shrill whisper that clawed at his mind. He covered his ears and screamed, but no sound came out. His head fell forward, and the rosary shattered, each bead striking the ground with a sound like drops of melting ice. Silence returned. When the smoke cleared, he was still kneeling, head bowed, hands clasped before his chest. But his eyes were frozen open, and his breath hung suspended mid-air. On the wall behind him, a new line of icy script appeared, curling like handwriting. In that death, I heard the sound of true repentance. The wind was still. Only a faint echo remained, far away the sound of a prayer that would never be finished. The prayer dissolved into the wind, leaving behind a suffocating emptiness. From afar came the dry, scraping sound of metal dragging across stone, steady, relentless, like someone pulling an endless chain. The darkness at the end of the corridor began to move. A faint torch flickered, revealing the heavy footsteps of the one approaching. It was the warden, tall and gaunt, draped in a wolfskin cloak, his eyes sunken like a man who hadn't slept in decades. A steel whip hung over his shoulder, the tip bound with a hooked blade that swung with every step, ringing sharply with each movement. He stopped before the frozen body of the priest, stared for a long moment, then smiled a dry, lifeless grin. Pulling a leather journal from his belt, he opened it to pages filled with small, dense handwriting records of deaths, dates, causes. The last entry was unfinished. 7th priest. Stopped praying. Ice sealed the mouth. He dipped his pen and wrote one more line, heard the voice of the wind. The storm outside howled louder, as if in answer. He closed the book, slipped it back into his coat, and spoke in a low, gravelly voice. The wind is the truest witness. It tells everything men try to forget. He stopped before a massive stone door and laid his hand on its frozen surface. Beneath the ice were hundreds of overlapping carvings, names, confessions, and final words written in blood. He murmured, "Each mark is a soul, and I am the one who keeps them here." A faint moan echoed from somewhere deep within, soft as breath. He tilted his head, listening, then smiled. Another one has arrived. The stone door creaked open, revealing a vast chamber beyond. The air inside was so thick with cold it felt alive. At the center stood a massive block of ice, clear as glass, shaped like a coffin. Inside, faint and blurred, was the outline of a woman, long hair tangled across her chest, hands pressed together over her heart. He approached slowly, set his torch into a wall bracket, and pulled out his pen. "Number 91, he said softly as he wrote. "Crime, claiming that the wind lies." He gazed into the ice, her lips were slightly parted, as if whispering. "What did the wind tell you?" he asked quietly. There was no answer, only the steady chill intensifying, making the torch flicker weakly. He leaned closer to the ice and, for an instant, thought her lips moved. A sharp crack split through the silence, a hairline fracture running across the coffin. He stepped back, eyes glinting with delight. Ah, it begins again. From the wall he retrieved a strange steel contraption, square and heavy, with a small slit in its center. An old recorder powered by gears and cold air. He placed it beside the ice, turned the crank, and the gears clicked. Tshk, 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 steady and rhythmic. "Report number 211, the voice of the soul," he murmured. Then, leaning close to the ice, his tone softened, coaxing. "You may speak. The wind will carry your voice far." For a long while, there was nothing. Then, from within the ice, came a faint, breath-like whisper, too weak to be human, more a vibration between two layers of frost. "It's not the wind that lies." He froze, tilting his head as a slow grin crept across his face. "It's mankind that forgot how to listen." The voice faded, and instantly the ice began to tremble. The body inside convulsed, both hands pressing hard against the inner surface, leaving deep imprints of fingers. The wind in the chamber rose, swirling into a vortex. The torch went out, leaving only the eerie blue glow radiating from the crack. He didn't flinch. Standing still, he lifted his hands, inhaling deeply. "You've spoken," he whispered. "You won't be silent anymore." The wind wrapped around him, sharper, colder, slicing through his skin until blood welled up and froze into tiny crystals on the floor. He stared at them with reverence. "Every voice is a wound," he said softly, "and I am only the one who records." The recorder still spun, but its rhythm had changed, no longer mechanical, but filled with whispers, laughter, fragmented cries. The ground quaked, ice shards lifted into the air like smoke. From within that frozen haze, the woman's eyes opened. Empty, hollow, no longer human. She stepped out of the ice, her feet not touching the ground, frost blooming where she moved. The warden stepped back, smiling with strange delight. "You can hear me, can't you?" he said. She didn't answer. Her head tilted, black hair sliding over her shoulders, each strand crystallizing into vapor. "You record the voices of the wind," her voice echoed, soft and layered. "But have you ever recorded your own?" He froze, his mouth trembling before he let out a dry laugh. "I don't need to," he said. "The wind will do it for me." She moved closer, her presence freezing everything around her. The recorder seized, frost crawling over the metal. In that suspended moment, the wind rose again, not howling, but singing, laughing, whispering, countless voices merging into one overwhelming tide. The warden threw his head back, arms spread wide, and in the dim shimmer of melting ice, he whispered, "At last, I can hear the symphony of sin." Behind him, the empty coffin of ice melted completely, spilling thick black water across the floor. Within it, faint green light flickered, hundreds of tiny souls swirling, spinning, searching for a way out. The night passed in absolute silence, broken only by the sound of wind whistling through cracks in the stone, like the slow breathing of an old beast. The dungeon was pitch black, and only when a stray beam of moonlight slipped through the ceiling did faint silver lines appear, falling directly onto something lying beside the wall, a pair of iron shoes, covered in white frost. They were placed neatly side by side, perfectly aligned, as if the person who once wore them had willingly stepped into their punishment. As I drew closer, I could feel the chill radiating from them, not the cold of snow or wind, but something deeper, like it came from the soul of the metal itself. Deep grooves were carved along their surface, evenly spaced, each one like a knife wound into human flesh. A small piece of paper was wedged beneath one sole, scrawled with trembling letters, "The last shoes I ever wore." Beside it, a dried trail of blood stretched toward the center of the room, almost buried under layers of frost, leaving only a faint brown stain behind. Perhaps someone had tried to remove them once, but the cold had won. The wind rose again, sharper now, carrying flakes of ice that swirled through the air, making the shoes tremble, then roll slightly as if touched by unseen hands. The clang of metal echoed through the chamber, like the grinding of teeth in agony. A hoarse voice broke the stillness from a dark corner, weak and distant, as if rising from deep underground. "We used to think fire was punishment, but we were wrong. The true horror is when your feet go numb with frost, yet you still have to keep walking." The voice faded, but its breath lingered, heavy and close. The air filled with the iron scent of blood, sharp, metallic and bitter. The shoes shifted again, harder this time, scraping the floor with a sound like dragging chains. A thin mist seeped from within them, curling upward, taking shape the faint outline of a man. His head bowed, his legs still bound in steel, and every time he tried to move, a groan of metal against stone shuddered through the room. Each step he took was slow, deliberate. Every lift of his foot cracked the ice beneath him, scattering white shards like splintered glass. "Do you know?" he rasped, his voice breaking. "At first, I thought they would protect me from the cold, but when the metal clasped around my skin, I realized nothing can hold warmth once the soul has gone cold." He looked down at his legs, where flesh and iron had become one. Bits of frost fell away, revealing raw, purpled skin split open beneath. "Can you hear it?" he whispered, his empty eyes staring through me. "My feet are still walking, even though I feel nothing at all." Then he moved again. Every step left a mark, not a footprint, but a burn, 2 charred streaks etched deep into the ice. He stopped in the center of the room and lifted his face. Half of it was eaten away by frost, one eye socket glazed white, yet his lips curved into a strange, broken smile, half mockery, half madness. "You want to hear something funny?" he said softly. "I was chosen to test this punishment because I stole a dead soldier's boots. They said justice meant making me wear the iron ones, until my feet became part of them. His voice sank to a whisper. I wore them for 3 days, then forgot what pain even felt like. Outside, the wind howled, and moonlight slid through the cracks in the wall, glinting off the shoes, 2 dull embers in the dark. The ground beneath them cracked open, releasing a pale white mist. Some believe that if you endure long enough, the cold turns into light, he murmured. But when I looked down at my feet, I saw the truth man never escapes his shackles, whether they are made of fire or of ice. His voice dissolved into the wind, vanishing like breath on glass. The shoes stood motionless in the center of the room, but the frost around their soles had melted away, revealing 2 small footprints, black, dry, scorched. From within them came a faint metallic rhythm, steady and hollow, like a dying heartbeat echoing in the silence. The wind swept through the cracks above, spinning the loose snow into a thin spiral. And within that swirling mist, the shoes seemed to stir again, turning slowly toward the mouth of the tunnel, as if someone unseen was still walking, forever, through a cold that would never end. The moonlight outside was fading, leaving only a thin beam piercing through the thick fog, shining onto the frozen stone floor. The dungeon had grown so silent that I could hear the blood in my veins, thick and slow, struggling to move. In the center of the chamber, an oil lamp flickered weakly, casting its light on the wall where the old warden sat, hunched over, holding an iron pen that dripped with blood. Before him lay an ancient notebook, its pages thick and yellowed, blotched with red stains, as if someone had soaked them in blood to write. Every line was a story, every page a scream, frozen forever in time. He didn't look at the lamp, only at the page where the newest line still glistened wet. The last shoes, the laughter vanished between the final breaths. He paused, lifted his head, eyes hollow like pits, reflecting the dying flame. They say I'm the one who records their sins, he murmured softly. But no one knows. It's this prison that forces me to write. It won't let me stop. He lowered his gaze and gave a crooked smile. I write not to remember, but to forget. Yet the more I write, the more I hear them. A faint wind slipped through, making the flame quiver, lighting up the walls. Words were carved everywhere, not just in his book, but all across the room. The writing had escaped the paper, crawling over the stone like veins, like the dungeon's own memory come alive. I record every groan, every dying breath, every whispered repentance. His voice faltered, rasping. And then I began recording what no one ever said. The iron pen trembled in his hand, a drop of dark blood falling onto the page. It wasn't ink, it was his own blood. He kept writing, the letters slanted, frantic, as if afraid that if he stopped, something in the dark would take the pen away. Night 900. The moan belongs to no one. It comes from the walls, from the wind, from the stone, from my own hand. He froze, trembling, breath shallow. That's right, he whispered. I've begun to hear the dungeon speak. A sharp crack echoed from the corner. Not the sound of ice breaking, it was the brittle snap of a bone. The warden's head jerked toward the darkness. The stone wall quivered. Frost dust fell away, revealing a narrow crack. From it poured a thin mist, coiling into the shape of a hand. He didn't flinch. He just lifted his gaze, eyes wide. You've come again, haven't you? A whisper replied, faint as breath moving through centuries. You shouldn't write anymore. The voice seemed to come from the stone itself, or from inside his skull. The warden chuckled quietly. If I stop writing, will you be silent? The air thickened, heavy with cold. The words on the walls glistened as though bleeding anew. He kept writing, faster now, his strokes wild, curling, no longer forming stories but invocations. They read with me. They're in the walls. They're in the cold. The wind surged suddenly, scattering the notebook's pages into the air. They flew wildly, slapping against the walls and sticking to the ice. Each sheet trembled, and when the oil lamp went out, a faint blue glow emerged from the words themselves. Each letter shimmered, then dissolved into the air, whispering softly. Keep writing, a woman's voice. Don't let me fade, a man's. Tell our story, so the ice won't swallow us, a child's trembling whisper. The warden collapsed to his knees, clutching his head, yet laughing hysterically. "Yes, I hear you. I'll write it all of it!" he screamed, driving the pen into his own hand, scrawling across the stone floor. Blood flowed, spreading over the ground. The scratching of metal echoed like a blade scraping bone. The last words he wrote could no longer be read, just tangled lines, spider-webbed across the room. Then suddenly, the wind stopped. Darkness swallowed everything. Silence, until a faint breath broke it. Not his. On the wall before him, where the blood had dried, a new line began to form, each stroke etched as if by invisible nails. He has written it all. Now, the dungeon will write the rest. And as that final word appeared, 100 pale blue lights began to glow from the cracks in the walls, tracing through every old inscription until the entire room shimmered like a frozen night sky. In that cold light, the notebook opened by itself. Its final blank page waited. The iron pen rolled forward, stopped at the center, then lifted, and began to write. No hand held it. But still, the pen moved steady, calm, as if the dungeon had finally learned how to tell its own story. That night, the cold wind swept through the long stone corridors, streams of white mist drifting from the cracks in the walls like wandering ghosts. The moonlight outside was smothered by thick fog, leaving only a faint grey glow spilling across the prison gate. Inside the dark chamber, the warden sat before a stone table. In front of him was a black wooden box, and inside it lay something that looked like a brass listening tube. He sat straight-backed, head slightly bowed, ear pressed close to the device, listening. On the table lay an open, thick notebook. Every line was neatly filled, each with a time, a location, and a brief note, sometimes only a few words. Soft moan, long scream, fell silent. The warden recorded everything with meticulous care, his broad hand guiding a fountain pen with practiced precision. Each time a faint noise echoed from afar, he paused, lifted his head, closed his eyes, then added another line. In the corner of the desk rested a small brass plaque engraved with the words, "Report of the Souls, Night 672. Beneath it, written by hand, "No one speaks, yet something is heard." The candle beside him burned weakly, its wax dripping in long streams that hardened into shapes resembling fingers clawing at the edge of the table. He didn't notice. He just kept listening. The first sound came a long, low hiss, like wind passing through a hollow pipe. He immediately wrote, "Subject in cell 3 still breathing." Then came the clanking sound of chains striking stone. "Subject in cell 7 fourth struggle." He glanced up, squinting toward the dark hallway, where only flickering torchlight moved with the rhythm of the draft sliding through the iron bars. Then he leaned forward again, lifted the listening tube from the box, and switched to a round metal disc etched with markings, what he called the sound keeper. He placed his hand on a lever, and the device began to play a drawn-out, ragged moan, torn straight from the throat of someone dying. The warden didn't blink. He smiled faintly, almost dreamlike, then began noting each pause, each tremor between breaths. Male voice. Approximately 30 years old, brittle bones, labored breathing, he murmured. Emotion, pleading, then despair. He drew 2 lines through the words, then added, "Good, clean, authentic." His eyes glinted with the satisfaction of a man who had found the perfect sound. Then he opened a small drawer beneath the table and pulled out a large glass jar filled with a thick, dark red liquid. He dipped his pen into it and continued writing, the strokes growing bolder and glossier. Each movement of the pen reflected a strange red shimmer, like fire burning in reverse. "They call me a demon," he muttered, "but no one knows. I'm just the keeper of their voices. If they fall silent, the world will forget them." Outside, the wind howled louder, like running footsteps. He didn't flinch. Suddenly, the sound in the tube changed, no longer cries, but a voice. Faint, human, and unmistakably clear. "You're writing something. With my blood." The warden froze, snapping his head up. The room was empty. No one there. He frowned, lowering his gaze to the jar of red ink. The liquid inside was swirling, bubbling softly. Impossible. He reached out, touching it lightly, and a chill like a blade pierced straight through his chest. The voice came again, this time not from the tube, but from everywhere, the walls, the wind, his own heartbeat. Can you hear it? Every scream you record, you carve into yourself. The warden staggered back, eyes wide in horror. The veins in his hands bulged and writhed, twitching as if something crawled beneath his skin. He collapsed, clutching his chest. A weak moan escaped his lips, the same sound he had just recorded minutes before. Crawling toward the desk, he grabbed the pen and scrawled across the open page. The sound seeps into the blood. Every cry becomes a pulse. Then he hurled the pen aside, gasping, eyes glassy with terror. In the corner, the soundkeeper began to turn on its own, gears grinding, metal whining. From it poured a chaotic blend of noises, voices, laughter, breath, and wind twisting together into something monstrous. He dragged himself toward it, trying to turn it off, but as soon as his fingers touched the metal, the device exploded into shards. Hundreds of pieces flew into his flesh. But from the wounds, no blood came, only thick, white vapor, freezing cold. The frost spread quickly, crawling across his chest, his throat, his face. In his final breath, the warden lifted his head toward the ceiling and smiled. Before his eyes froze over completely, he whispered, "Report. Complete." The notebook on the table flipped a page by itself. The pen rolled off the edge, then paused mid-air and began writing again. No hand held it, yet the words appeared steady. Warden number 3, recorded within his own report. Then silence. From the brass tube came one last sound, his voice, distorted and looping, fading like a broken record. I hear them. They hear me. I hear them. The phrase repeated, softer and softer, until all that was left was the sound of wind slipping through the half-open door, carrying away a report that would never be finished. They say that after the night the warden turned into ice, no one dared to enter that room again. But the following winter, a royal envoy arrived, carrying an order from the king. They came to retrieve the recordings of souls, what the emperor called the music of justice. Under the cold moonlight, the procession crossed the prison gates, their horses breathing out white smoke, boots sinking deep into snow. Leading them was a young official, slender, cloaked in crimson that blazed against the sea of white. He wasn't a warden or a guard, but a court musician chosen by the king to collect the sounds of this hell and turn them into a sacred symphony. He walked through the long corridors, the walls covered in moss and dried blood frozen into thick ice, the scrawled words fading beneath the trembling torchlight. In his hands, he carried a wooden box holding a new recording device, finer, smaller, and wrapped in human skin, soft, warm, and grotesque. They say, he chuckled softly, the last warden went mad from listening too much. I won't. I only want to hear the melody and death itself. He motioned for the guards to open the final door, the one leading to the warden's frozen corpse, still sitting before his stone desk. The cold burst out, sharp enough to sting their skin. Mist curled along the floor, and beneath the translucent ice, the warden's figure remained eyes open, hand still resting on the notebook. A frozen smile waiting for someone to continue his words. The musician leaned in, studying the face for a long time, then whispered, maybe he only recorded the sound to compose music for the king. The guards behind him said nothing. He gestured for them to leave, staying alone in the chamber. When the stone door shut, the only light left came from a single torch on the wall, casting a dim golden shimmer across the ice. He pulled the recorder from its box, set it gently on the desk, and adjusted the bright metal gears. A steady clicking filled the silence as the machine began to spin. He took a deep breath and pressed the earpiece to his head. At first, there was nothing but silence. Then, faintly, came a distant moan, thin, stretched, fragmented, like someone whispering through 100 layers of frost. He tilted his head, eyes gleaming. Second frequency, he murmured. Low resonance, drum-like. Then another sound joined in, metal scraping gasps, weeping merging into a chaotic stream of noise. He smiled, turning the crank to slow the tempo. The screams deepened, thickened, transforming into a rhythm dark, haunting, yet strangely melodic. Yes, he whispered with growing fervour. This is music. The the song of death itself. Sweat formed on his brow, even as the cold was sharp enough to freeze breath. He didn't stop swapping discs, spinning faster, desperate not to lose the moment. Every cry, every heartbeat, every final breath of the dead was split, reshaped, turned into tempo, into tone. "The king's music must sound like this," he muttered. "Not strings or flutes, but the harmony of crushed souls." Suddenly, the sound changed, no longer human voices, but laughter, warped and echoing. He froze, staring ahead. The block of ice before him trembled, a crack splitting across the warden's eyes. Something moved within. The musician stepped back, but couldn't pull the earpiece away. The laughter grew louder, clearer, blending with a familiar voice. "You hear it too, don't you?" His breath hitched, eyes wide, lips trembling without sound. "You want to turn their cries into music?" The voice continued, slow and heavy, dragging each word. "Then listen to it all." At once, the recorder screamed, a long wail followed by chaos. Chains dragging, bones snapping, hearts pounding, pleas breaking into silence, then rising again into shrieks. He clutched his head, screaming, but couldn't release the device. His hands were frozen to it, blood running from his ears, dripping onto the floor, turning instantly to white vapor. Amid the noise, a melody emerged steady, dreadful like someone playing an instrument made of human breath. Each note was a scream, each pause, a death. He collapsed, laughing wildly through the pain. "Magnificent!" he shouted. "This is what the king wanted, a symphony made from real souls." The stone door burst open, guards rushing in, but as soon as they crossed the threshold, they froze solid. The cold poured out of the room, spreading fast, while the torchlight shifted to a sickly green, reflecting off the walls, illuminating the musician's face. He sat motionless, eyes wide, mouth twisted in a delirious grin, but where his ears had been, there were only two hollow black pits. The recorder still turned, untouched. In the silence that followed, only one sound remained low, slow, like the heartbeat of something long dead. Night 673, composition complete. Out in the corridor, the wind swept along the frozen walls, carrying with it a faint chorus, as if unseen voices were singing the melody again, until everything faded into absolute darkness. The wind rose again, so cold that the flames in the corridor were strangled to a faint flicker, casting trembling light over the dried blood on the walls. After the musician was found, his body frozen together with the recorder, the royal court ordered the entire prison sealed. But no one dared to approach the room where his corpse lay, for every night faint music echoed sounds that no one could tell where they came from. Years passed, the ice grew thicker, covering everything. They said there was a deeper chamber beneath the main dungeon, reserved for a special punishment. The frozen coffin. Not everyone was honoured to rest within it. Only those guilty of the gravest sins, or who had angered the king, were sent below. The coffin wasn't made of wood or iron, but carved directly from ice, a massive block, clear and colder than metal. In the centre was a hollow just wide enough to bury a person up to the waist. The upper body was left exposed, trembling, naked against the cutting frost, while everything below slowly froze solid, tightening until no movement was possible. When they died, the ice swallowed their bodies whole, turning them into statues. When alive, they were people. In death, they became pillars of ice for the king. Tonight, a new prisoner was dragged down a woman, long-haired, her dress in tatters, but her eyes glowed with something fierce. She didn't scream or cry, only looked straight at the guards binding her with rope. "You think," she rasped, "the cold will kill me?" The guard said nothing, pulling her to the edge of the pit. The chill rising from below made them cover their faces. The frozen coffin gleamed a pale blue, reflecting the torchlight like a giant eye staring back. When they dropped her in, the impact cracked sharply, like ice splitting. She gasped, her breath turning to smoke. One guard dipped a ladle into a bucket of water and poured it over her head. The water froze instantly, clinging to her hair, her neck, spreading down her shoulders. 3 days, he said. "If you live after 3 days, the king may reconsider your crime." She looked up at him, smiling faintly, a small, strange sound that echoed in the emptiness. "I don't need the king to judge me," she whispered. "I just need the wind to hear me." Then she closed her eyes. On the first day, they heard her moaning. The wind rushing through the cracks stretched her voice into a thin, wavering song. The guards standing at the edge swore that by nightfall her breath had joined the wind, forming long echoes like bells fading through snow. On the second day, she fell silent. But from within the ice, a dim light began to glow. The guards panicked, tried to pull her out, but the moment their hands touched the ice, their fingers froze, fused to the surface. One screamed, another drew his sword, but the blade froze solid in his grip. They fled. That night, the song returned, not hers, but the wind's. The wind called each guard by name, in the woman's exact voice. By morning, they had all vanished, leaving only frozen pillars standing around the pit, like statues bowing their heads. On the third day, the king sent men to inspect. When the hatch opened, the first light spilled in, reflecting off hundreds of icy columns shining like diamonds. In the center, the woman still stood, eyes open, lips slightly parted. The frost around her was melting, water pooling at her feet, yet she did not fall. One official stepped closer, touched her hand, and recoiled. Her skin was soft, warm, and her heart still beat. "She's alive," he stammered. The ice couldn't kill her. The news spread quickly to the court. The king ordered her brought to the stone hall, wanting to see the one who defied the cold. When they carried her up, the ice around her had melted completely, leaving only mist swirling faintly around her body. The king stepped down from his throne, smirking. "You survived?" he said. "Was it the devil who saved you?" She lifted her head, her eyes burning bright. "No, your majesty," she answered softly. "Winter itself heard me sing." The king laughed and ordered her confined within the palace, calling her an omen of the gods. But from that night on, whenever the wind blew through the royal city, people heard her song echoing from everywhere, from the gates, from the frozen walls, from the deep wells. Some guards swore they saw her standing atop the ramparts, hair flowing in the wind, voice rising through the night. "I am not dead. I only sleep in the breath of snow." The people called her the Ice Woman, and in the dungeon records, only one brief line remained. Frozen coffin subject survived. Soul no longer belongs to the prison. From then on, no one dared use that punishment again, for fear that if the ice ever heard someone singing in the dark, it might open its eyes once more. News of the woman who survived spread across the land, and soon people began calling her the Witch of Ice. No one dared speak her true name anymore. Some said she was saved by a demon. Others claimed she was winter itself, trapped by mistake in human flesh. The king, torn between fear and curiosity, ordered a chamber built for her in the highest hall, 4 walls of clear ice, a floor of frozen stone, and a ceiling lined with thousands of tiny crystals that chimed like silver bells whenever the wind passed through. Each night, guards were posted at her door, but none ever dared to look inside. Some whispered that no torches burned within that room, only a soft blue glow that came from her body. Still, fear grew within the palace, because ever since she arrived the air had turned unnaturally cold. Snow fell even under sunlight, ice clung to the trees like pale blood, and the wind howled through the night, carrying her distant song. The king began to tremble. "If she is human," he said, "then why does her breath make this palace colder each day?" One morning, he ordered a bronze mirror brought in and set before her. "Look into this," he said, "and prove to me you are still human." She gazed into it and smiled, but in the reflection was not her face, only the image of winter, endless hills of snow, frozen trees, and thousands of souls drifting in the wind. The king staggered back in terror, shouting, "Take her away! Burn her if you must!" The guards rushed forward, but the moment they touched her, they froze solid. They didn't fall. They stood there, turned to statues, eyes blank. A thick mist filled the chamber. The king fled the hall, leaving his throne behind, and the wind that followed him sounded almost like laughter. They say she walked out of the ice chamber unhurried. With every step she took, the stone beneath her feet turned to snow. She killed no one. She merely brushed against their shoulders, and each person she touched stood motionless forever, some kneeling, some bowing, some mid-flight. When she reached the palace gates, a sudden blizzard fell from the sky. She lifted her face, lips moving as if singing, and the snow began to swirl around her. Each flake that touched her glowed, merging into her form until she vanished into a silver mist. When they finally entered the hall again, everything had frozen over. The throne was buried in white, and at the center stood a statue of ice, shaped like a woman, arms outstretched, eyes lifted toward the heavens. Her face was serene, her lips curved in a faint smile. Snow never melted on her shoulders, and the light from the dome above reflected through her body, making the entire room shine like it was made of silver. The king never returned to that palace. He ordered a separate dungeon built around the statue, naming it the Sanctum of the Frozen Saint, sealed with 7 iron locks and forbidding anyone from touching it. But the wind always found its way in, slipping through cracks and whispering faint songs within her songs. Ice does not kill me, nor hold me. It is only the door I have opened. A young guard once claimed he saw the statue move, not the whole figure, just the lips, trembling as if speaking. He nearly fled in terror, but then the wind stopped. In that silence, he heard her voice clearly, not from the statue, but inside his mind. "You feel cold, don't you?" He froze, unable to answer. The voice came again, softer than breath. "The cold is not punishment. It is an invitation." Then silence. When they found the guard the next morning, he was still standing there, facing the statue, eyes wide open, pupils faded to white. A thin layer of frost covered him. But what terrified them most was the faint smile on his face, the same as the statue's. After that, no one dared guard the sanctum of the frozen saint again. They built thick stone walls to seal the passage, bound it with iron charms and chains. Yet every winter, from deep within the earth, the whisper of wind still rises, mingling with the far-off drum of the storm, as if she still stands there, waiting for someone brave enough to walk through the door of ice once more. They say that ever since the ice statue of that woman was imprisoned in the holy dungeon, the land around the castle has never thawed again. Even in the height of summer, rivers stay frozen, birds no longer sing, and the sun only appears as a faint glow behind a veil of white mist. The villagers nearby don't dare look toward the palace, because whenever someone stares too long, they hear a voice whisper in their ear, soft, cold, and gentle as the wind. The voice doesn't threaten, it only murmurs, "Are you thirsty?" One young man, a gatekeeper, once heard it clearly on a heavy snow night. He thought he was hallucinating from thirst, so he forced a laugh and answered into the cold air. "Of course, but there's nothing here but ice," the voice replied. "Try it. Just a little." He knelt, scooped up a handful of snow, and brought it to his lips. The freezing taste spread across his tongue, numbing him, but then another sensation followed, sweet, faint, like the scent of flowers dissolving in breath. He swallowed quickly, feeling warmth rise in his throat. Thinking he was dreaming, he laughed and grabbed another handful. But when he looked down, it wasn't snow anymore. In his hand was a thin sheet of ice, transparent, and something moved inside it. He squinted and froze in terror. Trapped within the ice was a small human tongue, dark red, trembling, still alive. He threw it to the ground, stumbled back, gasping, but when the ice shattered, the tongue turned into a swirl of white vapor that slipped into his nose. He collapsed, clutching his throat, eyes bulging. From his mouth, steam poured out thick and heavy until his entire body was shrouded in mist. When snow fell again, only a human-shaped block of ice remained by the gate. The next morning, the guard on duty found him and ran screaming. They said the lips on that frozen figure were still parted, exhaling faint wisps of vapor, as if it were breathing. After that, the village was abandoned. No one dared stay near the dungeon anymore except for one man, an old monk who lived in a wooden hut by the forest edge. He had once been an exorcist, the last person who still believed that ice was not a demon but a mirror reflecting human sin. He'd heard the tales of the woman's curse, of snow that never melts, of cold that speaks, and decided to go to the forbidden place. He carried with him a candle, a bowl of salt, and a vial of holy water half frozen. When he arrived, the wind stopped. The world fell silent. The stone walls were blanketed in snow, and the chains on the gate trembled, though no one touched them. He He placed the candle down, knelt outside the gate, and began reciting a prayer for the dead, his voice shaking but steady. With each line, his breath turned to frost, clinging to the chains before vanishing. But before he was halfway through the prayer, the flame flickered out. He looked up. On the other side of the gate, through the thick mist, a figure appeared. A woman, hair long enough to brush the ground, white dress fluttering in the faint breeze. Her face was unclear, only her eyes glowed dimly, like moonlight on water. "You came to drive me away?" her voice asked, not loud, but it struck straight into his mind. The old monk trembled. "I came to set you free." She was silent for a moment, then stepped closer, just a few paces away. The chill from her body cracked the snow beneath his knees. "You cannot free me," she said softly, "for I was never imprisoned." Then she reached out and touched the iron chain. Without effort, the metal turned to powder, scattering into the wind. The heavy gate creaked open with a sound like a human groan. The monk stumbled back, raising his cross, but its light dimmed instantly in the cold air. She looked at him and smiled faintly, not cruel, only sorrowful. "You came to pray for me," she whispered, "but it's your prayer that woke the ice. Do you know why I survived? Because I learned to love the cold, and you still fear it." The monk tried to speak, but his lips froze, words trapped in his throat. The wind suddenly shifted, sweeping through, lifting her gown. For a moment, he saw her clearly: no skin, no flesh, just layers of clear ice forming the shape of a woman. In her chest, where a heart should be, glowed a small sphere of pale blue light. "This is what remains of me," she said, placing her hand over it. "The piece of winter that endures to remind mankind that every fear has the shape of itself." The monk tried to retreat, but ice had already crept up around his feet. In an instant, the cold surged through him, clouding his vision. Just before his body turned to ice completely, he heard her voice one last time, gentle, almost kind. "Don't be afraid. It's only asleep." When they found him the next morning, he was still kneeling, hands clasped in prayer, eyes open and facing the dungeon gate. On his lips was a thin layer of clear ice, glimmering with a faint blue light like a reflection of the woman's heart. People thought that after the holy ice dungeon was sealed, the kingdom would end all punishments involving frost. But the opposite happened. The king became more obsessed than ever. He believed that if winter could preserve a human soul in its perfect form, then it could also be used to preserve justice forever. And so, a new punishment was born: the blood-soaked ice pillar. In the center of the execution square, they raised a block of ice taller than a man, clear and sharp, reaching toward the sky like a colossal spear. Each day, a prisoner was tied tightly against it, arms spread wide, chest pressed against the frozen surface. No one died immediately. Every morning, the guards would take a small blade, thin as frost, and slice lightly into the shoulder, the neck, the stomach, just enough to make the blood flow. The moment the blood touched the ice, it froze, drop by drop, layer by layer, forming crimson veins running down the pillar. Every day, the prisoner was brought back and cut again, and the red spread further. After 30 days, the pillar was no longer transparent. It had turned into a crystal of blood, half glowing, half clouded, both beautiful and horrifying. The court called it the masterpiece of justice. Those chosen for this punishment were usually traitors or those who spoke ill of the king. But over time, even innocent townsfolk were dragged there just to beautify the pillar. When the cold was strongest, the blood refused to flow. The guards had to pour warm water over the prisoner, so the veins would bleed again, only to freeze instantly on contact with the air. Screams echoed across the square, mingling with the howling wind that whistled through the pillar's hollow veins, creating a strange sound, a mournful melody that never ended. The storyteller of that time, a wandering man who witnessed it all, once said, "When the wind blew through that pillar, I heard hundreds of voices, all begging for the same thing. Don't let me melt." But no one answered. The king stood on his balcony, looking down. The light from the pillar reflected on his face, painting his skin red. He called it the light of loyalty. At night, guards had to watch over it, for the pillar often trembled and emitted sounds like breathing. Some swore they saw the blood inside still moving, as if the souls trapped within had not found rest. One night, a curious guard stepped closer. placing his hand on the ice. He felt a faint pulse, like a heartbeat. Frightened, he pulled away, but his fingertips had already gone numb. And there, right where he had touched, another hand appeared from within. The hand was faint, blood-streaked, reaching outward. He screamed, but before he could move, the frozen hand touched him back. In an instant, his body turned solid. When his comrades found him, he was still standing, palm pressed to the pillar, eyes wide open, the reflection of crimson flowing within his pupils like real blood. The next morning, as the sun rose, the pillar was taller, larger than the day before, as if it had swallowed him whole. From then on, each time someone died near it, the ice grew thicker. The villagers called it the Hungry Pillar, because it never stopped growing. By the third year, its surface was streaked with countless red lines, dark and deep as veins. At night, if one looked closely, dozens of faces could be seen inside those who had been bound there, eyes open, staring outward. When the wind blew, people said they could hear the whispers of those faces blending with the crackling of the ice, forming a chilling refrain. "It's so cold, but don't let me melt." A young monk was ordered to document every phenomenon around the pillar to present to the king. He stood before the massive structure, trembling, pen in hand. In his journal, the last line he wrote read, "I see within the pillar not just blood, but memory. Every crack is a confession. Every shard is a scream. If justice truly exists here, then it has frozen along with the souls of the innocent." After he vanished without a trace, his journal was found beneath a tree near the pillar, soaked and hardened with frost. On the last page was a clear handprint, not in ink, but in dried blood, dark as garnet and cold as metal. And when the book was opened, a sudden gust of wind blew through, carrying with it a long, sharp whistle like the sound of the pillar laughing. After the blood-soaked ice pillar, the king believed he had found the language of souls, the way ice and blood could speak together. But then he wanted to hear the voice of man when he could no longer speak. And so, the snow collar was born, a device that seemed simple, yet so cruel that even the blacksmiths who forged it were blindfolded afterward, so they would never see what their hands had made. The collar was forged from black iron, shaped like a circular band, hollow on the inside, with small grooves on the outside for pouring water. When a prisoner was tortured, the collar was placed around their neck, and water was poured slowly into it. At first, it was just ordinary water, but in the freezing air of the dungeon, it turned to ice instantly. Layer by layer, the ice thickened, tightening around the neck until the person couldn't move, couldn't breathe deeply. Every breath was a faint cracking sound, like a string pulled to its breaking point. When the ice sealed completely, the prisoner's throat could no longer produce sound. The collar didn't kill them right away, it turned them into mute beings, capable only of staring. Some endured the punishment for days, their eyes losing all fear, leaving only emptiness, as if their souls had left, and only their frozen bodies remained to suffer the cold. They said that at night, when the wind swept through the hallways lined with those who wore the collars, it whistled through the frozen throats, creating a ghastly chorus like 100 people grinding their teeth at once. The sound went on all night, so dreadful that even the guards dared not sleep. An old warden once said, "There is no punishment quieter than this, yet no scream more terrifying." For the collar did not just bind the neck, it trapped the final breath, freezing it in the air. Each morning, when the faint light broke through, one could see thin mist escaping from the prisoners' mouths. Not real mist, but their old breath, still struggling to escape the ice. The cold stopped everything, but not the remnants of life. In those frozen layers lingered a faint trace of warmth, a reminder that even bound and broken, man had not yet fully died. Once, a prisoner named Caro, a blacksmith who had served in the army, was accused of treason and sentenced to the snow collar. When the water was poured down his neck, he didn't scream. He just stared at the guards, his eyes not filled with hatred, but as cold as the metal he once forged. As the collar tightened, he spoke only 4 words. "You don't understand." Then his voice vanished. That night, as the wind blew through the corridors, other prisoners heard whispers around them. At first, they thought it was the wind, but the words grew clearer, short, broken phrases, like a man speaking in a dream. "Don't understand. Don't understand." The voice didn't stop until dawn. When the warden opened the door, Caro was still standing, ice wrapped around his neck, eyes closed, mouth slightly open, as if smiling. On his collar were tiny engraved symbols. No one knew how they got there. Small interlocking circles like ancient runes. They tried to break the collar to remove his body, but every hammer and chisel shattered on impact. In the end, they left him there, standing in the corridor, and from then on, it was called the Hall of Silent Breaths. Guards assigned to that corridor were only allowed 15 minutes at a time, for anyone who stayed longer claimed to hear someone whispering their name. Some went mad, bashing their heads against the walls to block the sound. Others fled the dungeon entirely. The king ordered the hallway sealed with iron doors, but at night, the wind still slipped through, carrying the shrill whistling of hundreds of frozen throats, forced to sing their final mournful hymn. Some say that if you press your ear to the sealed wall, you can still hear breathing, faint, slow, steady like the heartbeat of the dungeon itself, still alive within that endless, frozen silence. After the snow collars were locked tight around their throats, silence swallowed the entire dungeon. No one could scream anymore. No more begging, no more prayers, only the wind and the cold clang of metal against stone. But then, from deep within the darkness, among hundreds of bodies bound in place, came another sound. Click, clack, click, clack. At first it was faint, scattered, like pebbles rolling across the floor. But gradually it grew clearer. It was the sound of teeth chattering. When the cold crept down their necks and through their lips, their teeth began to strike against each other endlessly. Hundreds of those sounds merged into one strange resonance, an eerie, broken symphony. At first, the wardens thought it was just reflex, but then they realized the rhythm had structure. There were pauses, repetitions, subtle patterns, as if someone was trying to speak. One night, a young guard stood outside the hallway, listening to that rhythm that went on for hours. Slow, steady, deliberate. He shuddered and pressed his ear to the wall. Between the clicking and clattering, he noticed short breaks, like dots, followed by rapid bursts like rushed words. He didn't understand it with reason, but by instinct. They were communicating, not with words, but with pain. The next morning, he told the warden, "They're talking to each other with their teeth." The warden sneered, thinking he'd gone mad, but that night, he too heard it. It was no longer the sound of individuals, it filled the air, resonating through the walls, echoing through the arches like wind carrying voices of the dead. A sound so cold it made him forget to breathe. The next morning, he ordered every prisoner's mouth to be bound shut with cloth to silence the noise. But even bound, even when their mouths couldn't move, the sound persisted. It no longer came from their mouths, it came from inside the ice itself. The prisoners no longer trembled from cold, they trembled to speak. Each strike of teeth became a beat, and through those beats, messages were passed. In the stillness, the dungeon became a place where every small sound carried meaning. Sometimes, from the far corner of the hall, a series of fast, desperate clicks echoed, and from the other end, a slow, deep rhythm replied. Those who witnessed it said that if you stood long enough, you could feel they were telling a story, not with words, but through the trembling rhythm of bone and frost. One night, a priest imprisoned for defying the crown was thrown into that hall. He heard the clicking all around and thought it was ghosts. But when he sat down and the cold cut through his neck, his teeth began to chatter too. At first, from fear, then from cold. But soon, he realized he was joining them. Without meaning to, he created his own rhythm, short, uneven taps, and strangely, the sound around him answered back. He closed his eyes, letting his body shake in time with theirs. In that moment, he understood they were all saying the same thing, the pain of being forgotten. None of them remembered who they were anymore. They only knew that the sound of teeth was proof they were still alive. The chattering had become the dungeon's final soul. Every night, when wind swept through the dark corridors, even the stone walls trembled along. Guards heard the sound, even after they left in their dreams, in the wind, in the beating of their own hearts. One young guard went mad after 7 nights. With sunken eyes and a cracked voice, he whispered, "They talk to each other. I heard them call my name. And last night, when I clenched my teeth in fear, they answered me, in my own voice. The warden, furious, ordered every prisoner's teeth shattered to end the noise. Iron hammers struck down, and the sound of breaking teeth mixed with muffled sobs, echoing everywhere. But soon after, something horrifying happened. Barely a moment of silence passed before the sound returned. Softer now, fainter like pebbles grinding together. The prisoners no longer had teeth, yet the chattering continued. Because it no longer came from their bodies, it came from their fear. The walls, the bars, the ice beneath their feet all began to tremble, to hum, to click together. The dungeon became a living thing, shivering to the rhythm of hundreds of silent souls. When the wind blew through, thousands of sounds intertwined, forming an ancient, indecipherable language. From then on, the dungeon earned a new name, the House of the Wind's Teeth. And even now, long after it was abandoned, even with no prisoners left inside, that chattering still echoes whenever winter returns, like those lost souls are still trying to tell a story that mankind has grown too cold to hear. Since the dungeon was named the House of the Wind's Teeth, no one dared to descend into its lower levels anymore. But there was still one man who stayed, a grey-haired warden, his hair turned silver from frost, living in the dark among the frozen snow collars that still clung to the necks of others. He had served there for over 30 years, and was the last one who could still hear the sound of teeth clashing, even though the mouths that made them had long since turned to ice. He was no longer afraid. In fact, every night, he would sit beside a small torch and listen, counting each rattle of teeth carried by the wind, as if he were listening to old friends whispering. Gradually, he began to recognize distinct tones. They weren't just random rattles, they were words, real words, flickering faintly inside his mind. At first, they were scattered fragments. Cold. Hear. Listen. But the more he listened, the clearer they became. Then, a woman's voice spoke, soft, distant, yet as clear as if she were standing right behind him. "Can you hear me?" she asked, her voice as gentle as the breeze. He jolted, turned around, but there was no one there, only the trembling glow of the torch. Thinking he'd imagined it, he whispered, "Who's there?" No answer, only the faint sound of teeth grinding, like laughter. The next night, the voice returned, speaking longer this time, telling him things he had never known. The names of those who had died in the dungeon, the secrets buried deep in the ice, the curses that had never thawed. "They're still here," the voice said, "and they're listening to you." The old warden began to lose sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw himself standing in the corridor, surrounded by hundreds of bodies bound upright, their throats sealed in ice, their mouths open wide, and from each one came a stream of white mist, spiraling into rings. Inside that mist he saw faces, eyes staring directly at him. They weren't angry or afraid, they looked as if they were waiting for him to answer something. He woke in the middle of the night, cold sweat freezing on his skin, but the voice was still there, whispering around his ears. "You are the last who can still hear us. Keep my voice before it fades." From that night on, he stopped speaking to anyone. He stopped writing, stopped opening the gates. He only sat silently in the corridor, his ear pressed to the icy wall. They said he could sit like that for hours, eyes wide open, lips moving without a sound. When other guards asked what he was doing, he simply replied, "I'm listening to them." One night, at the end of the season, there was no fire left in the dungeon, only the moonlight filtering through a small window. He sat beside an old snow collar, the one that once belonged to a prisoner named Caro. His hand trembled as he placed it on the cold metal, and beneath his palm, the ice quivered slightly. From within came the voice he'd heard for so many nights. "Do you know who I am?" He answered, his voice hoarse and low. "You are the voice inside the ice." The voice chuckled softly. "No, I am the part of you that you buried long ago." Winter only kept it safe. From the frozen wall, a figure emerged, half man, half mist, with a blurred face, but eyes that mirrored his own from his youth. It looked at him, smiled sadly, and said, "You've listened to me all this time, but you've never answered. So now, I'll ask you one last time. Do you want to stay with me, or do you want to forget?" He froze, his breath locking in his chest. Around him, the sound of teeth clashing grew louder, hundreds, thousands, all striking at once, as if the entire dungeon was waiting for his reply. He placed his hand on the wall of ice where the figure was fading and whispered, "If I forget, who will remember you?" The voice replied, "No one, but if you remember, you will never rest again." He laughed, a dry, brittle sound echoing through the frozen air. "I have never rested," he said, "not since the first night I heard those teeth." The shadow was silent, then melted into the cold. He remained still, his hand frozen to the wall, his eyes slowly clouding over. When the guards found him the next morning, his body was frozen solid, his face calm, as if he had fallen asleep. But on the wall beside him, where his ear had once pressed, there were faint words carved deep into the ice. "I have heard, and I will tell." Since then, they say that whenever the wind rises inside the old dungeon, you can still hear the voice of that old man mingling with the sound of clashing teeth, retelling the stories of the souls who were never truly heard. That night, I was there, not in a dream, not as someone hearing stories from others, but standing in the corridor where the old warden had fallen. I arrived late, when the torches were dead, when frost had covered the floor in white, and only a pale shaft of moonlight slipped through the small window high above, spilling onto the frozen stone. The air smelled of metal and wind, that distinct scent of the winter dungeon, where even breath turned into chains. I hadn't meant to stay long. They sent me only to record a note. The warden died in the night. But the moment I stepped inside, I knew I wouldn't leave so easily. There was something in that place that made my heart tighten. I heard the wind slipping through the iron bars faint, but not merely wind. It had rhythm, a pulse, like breathing, like the faint chattering of teeth echoing from inside the walls, slow and steady, as if someone was still alive. I walked toward him. The old warden, they said, had turned to stone while listening to a voice no one could hear. He sat motionless, head bowed slightly, both hands pressed against the wall. His face was strangely calm, as though asleep amidst the snowstorm. But what chilled me wasn't his expression, it was his hands. They weren't frozen like those of a man dead from cold, they were dissolving into mist, seeping into the stone. When I reached out and touched the icy surface, it trembled, and I heard him. Not clearly, not with my ears, but with something deep inside my bones. "You came." Just one sentence, soft as a breath. I stepped back, heart pounding. Then another sound rose, not from him, but from hundreds of voices interwoven, echoing from within the ice. The sound of teeth clattering, sighs, whispers, wordless songs. They merged into a terrible harmony, yet with rhythm, with purpose. I understood instantly. This was no illusion. He had been right. The souls in the ice were speaking, and I had heard them. The wind surged through the corridor, snuffing out the candle I carried, leaving only the pale moonlight to bathe everything in white. In that ghostly light, I saw countless handprints forming on the walls, faint as smoke, reaching out from beneath the ice, stretching toward me. A woman's voice rose weak, but clear. "You hear me, don't you?" The words didn't travel through the air, they rang inside my head. Each syllable pierced my mind like shards of frost. I didn't answer. I just stood there, frozen, as the ice before me cracked softly. Silver fissures spread across its surface like veins, and behind them, something moved. A face half human, half ice pressed against the wall. Her eyes were open, cloudy, but still burning through me. "He was right," I heard myself whisper. Because that night, I heard it too. The moment those words left my lips, I felt the frost crawl up my neck, sliding over my skin as though unseen hands were pulling me in. I tried to step back, but my feet were glued to the frozen floor. The clatter of teeth began again, but this time, it wasn't coming from the ice. It came from me. My own mouth moved without command. I heard my teeth joining the chorus, blending into the rhythm of countless others. And in that moment, I understood the dungeon didn't just imprison bodies. It imprisoned everything they had ever said, feared, or dreamed. All of it sealed in ice, existing beside me. I heard children crying, broken prayers, a woman calling someone's name in despair. Each sound was a memory, a fragment of a life trapped within the frost. The wind swept through, and those voices shattered into vapor, brushing against my skin like 1,000 tiny blades of cold. I fell to my knees, hands over my ears, but the voices still filled my head. "You've heard us now, so you must tell." A shiver ran down my spine. I knew this was no longer a place for the living, yet part of me couldn't leave. The more I listened, the more I felt myself becoming one of them, part of the dungeon, part of the ice, part of the endless sound of chattering teeth. In that moment, I could no longer tell what was wind, what was voice, what was my own breath. Only one sensation remained. Everything was melting together. When I opened my eyes again, the candle was gone, and the words people said the warden had left behind, "I have heard, and I will tell," were now cracked open, revealing another line beneath. "Now it's your turn." I don't know how long I stood there. I only know that since that night, every time the wind blows, I still hear someone whispering my name softly, but clearly, like the ice itself is laughing deep inside the walls. The eighth instrument of torture was found in the deepest chamber of the winter dungeon, where no human breath had ever lasted more than a few minutes. They called it the cage of breath, not for its shape, but for its horrific purpose, to capture every breath of its victim until that very breath froze, tightened, and killed them from within. Its construction was simple: a thick steel mask, fitted with narrow hollow tubes extending outward, crafted to seal perfectly against a person's face. Once it was placed on, there was no more air, only the heat of the victim's own lungs. With every exhale, the warmth instantly froze within the tubes, forming ice crystals that blocked the air from returning. The harder they tried to breathe, the thicker the frost became, until the entire mask became a prison built from their own breath. One guard said he once watched a man thrash beneath the mask, eyes rolling back, mouth open, desperate to inhale but drawing in nothing but shards of frozen vapor. His breathing sounded like breaking glass, sharp, dry, cracking. Then, silence. When the mask was finally removed, what remained was no longer a face, just a transparent shell of ice shaped like one, still holding the last twisted smile of agony. The dungeon chronicler said that when light passed through that ice, it reflected across the chamber, creating countless overlapping faces, all with open mouths, all silent. But the terror wasn't in the sight of death, it came afterward. Each time someone was killed with the cage of breath, the warmth from their body didn't vanish as usual. It lingered, suspended in the air, trapped inside the chamber. Years later, when no more executions were carried out there, the guards swore they could still feel human warmth, thick, damp, suffocating. Each time they stepped inside, they had to hold their breath, because the longer they breathed, the heavier the air became, clinging to their skin, burning their throats like inhaling frozen iron. One curious man named Eldrick, tasked with cleaning the torture devices, once dared to open one of the old masks left in storage. He said it was still warm, even after decades of dust. When he pressed his ear to the breathing tube, he heard a whisper faint as wind slipping through a crack in the door. "Let me breathe one more time." Eldrick dropped the mask, but the whisper didn't stop. Instead, it multiplied, echoing in his mind, spreading through the chamber, merging with the cold wind into hundreds of breathing sounds. That night, he fled the dungeon and was never seen again. Only his boots remained frozen to the steps leading down to the chamber, as if he had dissolved into the air itself. Later, some claimed that if you walked into that chamber, you could feel the warmth of dead throats coiling around you, soft, ghostly, as if unseen souls were breathing beside you. A priest was once permitted to descend into the chamber to perform an exorcism. He carried a silver crucifix and a vial of holy oil, but when he uncorked it, the scent refused to spread, as if something in the air was holding it in. He began to pray, reciting his verses, but halfway through, his throat seized. He tried to inhale but felt as though someone else was breathing with him, through him, from the inside. He dropped the crucifix, collapsed, and when they pulled him out, his face was pale, lips blue, eyes wide open, reflecting the image of the steel mask that still sat at the bottom of the pit. He never spoke again, only tapping weakly on his bed with his fingers, counting as if marking each breath. Before he died, he managed to write 3 words on his bedsheet: "The air remembers." After that, no one dared to mention the cage of breath again. Yet every cold night, people still claim to hear soft breathing echoing through the abandoned halls, not the sound of wind, but of something trying to live again in the space mankind once believed would remain silent forever. They say that when one opens a mask in the chamber of the breath cage, they don't just see the frozen face of the dead, they see the very shape of their final breath. That was the origin of a legend. When the mask was opened, they saw only a layer of ice moulded into a face of despair. The last remaining mask was kept in room 7 of the dungeon, a place only the warden was allowed to enter. But he had never dared to look closely. People said that whenever torchlight flickered through the tiny hole on the mask's surface, one could see, behind the translucent ice, a pair of eyes open staring straight at the living. At first, they thought it was just a trick of the light. Until one night, a new guard on the night shift grew curious and leaned down to look. The wavering torchlight reflected off the steel, and inside the mask, he saw a face, not the face of the dead but his own. The reflection twisted, grinned awkwardly, eyes glistening, and then it moved. It opened its mouth, but there was no sound, only a thin wisp of vapor escaping from the lips, drifting outward until it touched his skin cold as metal. He recoiled, startled, and the flame in his hand went out. In the darkness, the cold spread, and he heard a whisper, "Breathe deeply. I want to see you." The next morning, he was gone. Only a damp mark on the floor remained, as if someone had lain there, and the steel mask no longer glistened with frost. It was dry, cold, and shinier, as if polished by human breath. The warden ordered room 7 to be sealed, but that same night, he heard something breathing behind the door. At first, he thought it was wind slipping through a crack, but the sound persisted, steady, slow, rhythmic, like someone trying to stay calm through fear. He called the guards to bring torches, but inside, there was nothing. Only the mask, lying quietly on the table, glowing with a pale blue light. He leaned closer and saw that the ice inside the mask was no longer flat, but gently swelling as if something beneath it was breathing. He reached out with a trembling hand, touched the mask, and the ice shivered, expanding and contracting like human lungs. It felt alive. He pulled away, but it was too late. A thin mist seeped out, curling slowly into his nose, his mouth, his eyes. The cold filled his lungs, choking him. He tried to cough, but couldn't. His throat tightened, and then he heard it. Not from outside, but from inside himself, a faint whisper. "Don't be afraid. I'm only borrowing your breath." The warden collapsed, convulsing. When the guards rushed in, his body was stiff, eyes wide open, staring at the ceiling where a thin cloud of vapor rose, taking the shape of a human face. After that, room 7 was sealed forever. But strangely, from that day on, anyone who walked down the west corridor found that their breath would take shape in the air even if they never spoke. Some said they saw faces form within their own breath. Some strangers, others their own, older, distorted or weeping. Since then, the workers in the dungeon began to avoid breathing deeply, believing that every strong exhale might awaken a soul lingering in the air. On certain nights, when the wind passed through and moonlight spilled across the empty corridor, the vapor would rise into dozens of human shapes standing against the walls, all facing the doorway, all with mouths open, as if about to speak. When morning came, they would vanish, leaving only a thin layer of dew on the stone. A young priest who once visited the dungeon described the feeling in his journal. "The air here is not empty. It is full, so full that every time I inhale, I feel as though I am breathing in someone else's memories. Every breath has a shape, and every shape carries its own fear." From then on, people whispered a single warning. If you walk the hall of frost, never exhale. But that warning only fueled curiosity. One young guard, who had heard too many ghost stories and believed them all to be superstition, decided to test his courage. He stood in the middle of the corridor, drew in a deep breath, and exhaled hard, laughing, "Let's see who dares to appear." But his breath didn't fade. It hung there in the air, suspended, then stretched and twisted into the shape of his own face, its eyes hollow, its mouth sealed tight. He stumbled back, terrified, as the face opened its mouth and repeated his exact words in his own voice, colder, deeper, drawn out. "Let's see who dares to appear." Then the face dissolved into mist and drifted straight into his mouth. He fell to the ground, trembling. When his comrades found him, his body was ice cold, and his final breath escaped, his lips shaped like a faint, smiling face, before vanishing completely. Since that night, people have said that in the winter dungeon, every breath is an invisible mask. And if one day you inhale the breath of someone who died there, it will be your face that becomes the next one trapped forever inside the ice that never melts. People used to think punishment only happened in the dark, where wind and screams blended into one. But when the king decided that death should become a spectacle, the gallows of light was born. It wasn't merely a machine of death, it was a grand stage in the middle of the square, where the condemned were hung among snow and ice under the moonlight, turned into living statues. Each person was tied to an iron post in the white snowfield. Above them, a frozen crystal mirror that refracted the moonlight. When the light passed through, it split into thousands of beams that reflected across their bodies, making them glow in the night. But that light carried no warmth. It was sharp, cold, and silent as a blade. Wherever the rays touched, their skin cracked, and thin blood froze instantly into red veins tracing across their flesh, beautiful and cruel all at once. The guards called it the king's art. The townsfolk were forced to watch, standing at a distance, trembling in the cold. They weren't allowed to cover their eyes, for to look away from that light was to insult the justice of the throne. The entire square shone bright, flooded in silver light as cold as mist. In that glow, the bodies hung upright, eyes open, lips trembling, breaths turning into vapor seen from afar. They looked like living ice sculptures. No one dared to speak, because even their breath was caught by the light, reflected across the icy ground, multiplied 100-fold like countless faces staring back. A painter of the court was ordered to capture the scene, for the king believed that only art could immortalize obedience. His name was Lirhan, a young man of great talent, but cursed with eyes that saw too clearly. When he arrived, the sight froze him in place. He saw not criminals, but villagers, soldiers, even women. They didn't scream, but their eyes wide and glassy reflected the moonlight with terrifying clarity. When he lifted his brush, his hand shook. Every time the light flickered, the frozen figures seemed to twitch, as if trying to escape the ice. He began to paint. Every stroke was cold. Every smear of colour shimmered on the snow. Each brushstroke felt like he was recording a final breath. But the longer he painted, the more dreadful it became. The painting started to move. Each time he stopped, the moonlight reflected off the wet paint, and the faces within began to stir. They blinked. Slowly, their eyes turned toward him. He stumbled back in terror, but the painted eyes followed. That night, he burned all his canvases except one, the one he didn't dare destroy, because it was still breathing. They say he brought the painting back to his chamber, locked the door, and was never seen again. When the guards broke in, the room was blanketed in a thin mist. On the table lay the unfinished painting, still damp, and on the chair sat Lirhan motionless, eyes open, frost clinging to his face. In the painting, there was one more figure, now him standing among the frozen statues, eyes dull, mouth twisted, brush still clutched in his hand. The tale spread, and the king forbade anyone to speak of the gallows of light again. But the people never forgot. On nights of the full moon, they said the snow still shimmered with faint human silhouettes like mirrors that could breathe. And if one stared long enough, the figures blinked. Monks claimed the light was the echo of souls trapped between life and death. They prayed, they chanted, but it did no good. The light always returned, each winter brighter, stronger, spilling into every house, touching every face. Some said that one night, a lost child wandered into the square and saw the living statues still standing. The child approached, and when their small hand brushed the icy face, the statue opened its eyes and stared straight back. In that instant, the child saw their own reflection inside those eyes, terrified, trembling, crying. The villagers called it the moonlight, that remembers a light that didn't just shine, but collected the faces of all who dared to look at it. And perhaps that is why, ever since the gallows were buried under snow, no one has dared to look into a mirror beneath the moon again, for fear that one day the reflection staring back will not be their own, but that of a frozen figure smiling within the ice. After the night, the young painter Lirhan turned to stone in his room. His story spread quickly throughout the capital, but no one in the court dared to mention his name before the king. It was an omen of death. The king ordered Lirhan's painting to be hidden deep beneath the palace, then sent for others to continue his work. One painter dies, 10 will take his place. the king said, "for my light cannot be extinguished." So 10 new painters were brought into the palace, each ordered to recreate the gallows of light from memory, though none of them had ever dared go near the place. They were locked inside a chamber lined with mirrors and ice, where only the moonlight shone through a crystal dome. On the first day, they began to paint. Each chose a different angle, a different image, a different light. But when night fell, all the paintings became the same. On each canvas were human figures hanging straight in the snow, light reflecting through ice, and in every pair of eyes painted, there appeared one face, the face of the painter himself. Terrified, they burned their works. But by morning, the ashes on the floor had formed the clear shape of a hand, each finger distinct. One of them, an old man blind in one eye, whispered, "The light is painting itself." No one understood, but that night they began to hear something, not the wind, but the sound of brushes sweeping across canvas, steady and endless, though none of them were painting anymore. A curious guard opened the door, torch in hand, and swore he saw the paintings moving the light across the canvas, shimmered like vapor, and the painted faces slowly turned toward him, smiling faintly, their eyes wet and sorrowful. He ran, unable to speak, trembling as he said that the light could see. Soon after, one by one, the painters went mad. They no longer slept or ate. They sat in silence, stroking empty frames, murmuring nonsense. One of them painted with his own blood, claiming that only true red could keep the light from taking his soul. But when the painting was finished, and moonlight fell upon it, the red turned transparent. He screamed, driving the brush into his own eye. Later, they found him slumped against the wall, his face imprinted with his own bloody hand, his remaining eye wide open, reflecting a pale glimmer like the moon outside. The king, enraged, declared the painters cursed by their guilt, and ordered all their paintings buried in the same vault as Lehan's. But once the last painting was sealed away, the moonlight over the city began to change. No longer silver-white, but tinged with blue. Every night, the walls of the palace flickered, as if invisible strokes of a giant brush were repainting the city in cold light. Townsfolk said that when they walked past the frozen lake near the old dungeon, they saw faces of the dead reflected in the ice, pale, luminous, as if someone was repainting them stroke by stroke. One fisherman looked down into the lake under the full moon and saw his own reflection not as he was, but as he would be, hanging upon the icy gallows, with light piercing through his chest. He went mad with fear, fled the village, and left a scrawled message on the shore. "The moonlight is painting us." In the court, an old priest was summoned to cleanse the curse. He entered the chamber where the forbidden paintings were stored, carrying a silver cross and a vial of holy oil. When he opened the vial, the torches flared high. There was no wind, yet the light in the room trembled, as if something unseen moved through it. The empty frames leaning against the walls began to glisten with dew. He stepped back, muttering prayers. But across each frame, each stretch of canvas, lines began to appear, not drawn by hand, but by the moonlight sliding through the window. The shapes on the canvases were the dead of the winter dungeon, one by one, suspended in the light, their hollow eyes staring outward. The priest fell to his knees, praying frantically, but the moonlight kept painting, and every time he spoke the name of God, another face opened its eyes. When he died, they found him with his eyes open, the reflection of the snow-covered gallows frozen in his pupils. After that, the chamber was sealed with iron, and no one dared approach it again. Yet every full moon, light still slipped through the cracks beneath the door, casting faint human silhouettes across the floor, and those who dared look long enough swore they saw one new figure among them. A man holding a brush, his left eye a deep red stain, his lips moving as if still painting the unfinished work he had never completed. After the chamber was sealed and moonlight was no longer allowed to enter the palace, the king ordered a new source of energy to be found. He wanted a light he could control, a storm that could turn at his command. And from that desire, the blood windmill was born. No one knew exactly who conceived it, only that the first man to design it was hanged before finishing his plans, and those ordered to continue the work went mad after seeing it in motion. It was a massive machine, built on a frozen wasteland not far from the winter dungeon. 4 iron blades, black as night and as wide as the arms of a giant, were joined by chains and bones. The body of the mill was made of frozen wood and stone, with a mechanism inside that turned by human strength. The blades didn't move by natural wind, they turned by prisoners bound to them, forced to push, run and pull until the machine began to spin. As they moved, blood from their torn hands dripped into the cracks of ice, dyeing every rotation red. That was why it was called the blood windmill. Each time it turned, the ground shook. The scream of steel mixed with human moans, sounding like an endless, broken hymn. The wind it made was not cool, it was hot, from the friction of metal, carrying the scent of iron, of skin, of burning frost. People said that if you stood close enough, you could see that wind glowing faintly red, as if sunlight itself had been soaked in blood. The prisoners forced to serve as the gears of that machine never survived more than 3 days. Their bodies were not buried, they were ground beneath the base of the mill to keep the gears slick. Over time, the ice beneath it thickened, glimmering like crystal, and if you looked closely, you could see shapes, hands, faces, limbs frozen inside the red frost. A young soldier, tasked with guarding the machine, once said that on his second night of watch he heard voices. Not living ones, but small, trembling whispers that repeated with every turn of the blades. Stop. Stop. At first he thought it was just the wind, but soon the voices found rhythm. Every spin carried another plea. When the windmill stopped, silence fell so heavy it hurt the ears. He looked up and saw red frost covering the blades, and along the steel edges, something moved, frozen blood cracking open, forming jagged lines that spelled out, "Every turn is a soul." He told his commander, but no one believed him until the commander himself heard it. Not through the air, but inside his mind, like the heartbeat of the earth whispering, "Stop, we are still here." From then on, no one dared approach it except those forced to. But strangely, even without workers, the mill kept spinning, slowly, steadily, as though something beneath the ground was pulling it. They tried dismantling it, smashing its gears, breaking its axle, but by morning the mill stood whole again, turning silently, the deep groan of its rotation echoing like the wind calling someone's name. Some said it turned with the breath of the dead, the souls crushed into eternal motion. Even miles away, when storms rose, people could hear its metallic scream, because that was when the windmill spun fastest. Across the snow, the blood it stirred was carried into the air, forming crimson mist against the sky like a burning sunset trapped in ice. A priest was sent to perform a cleansing ritual. He planted a cross in the snow and began to pray. But as the wind rose, the cross shook violently, sinking into the ice. He kept chanting until his voice merged with the shriek of the blades. They said the machine swallowed him whole, his body shattered into dust, leaving only his cloak tangled in the gears, forever stained red. After that, no one dared speak of the windmill again. It still turns, even with no life nearby, like a metal heart that refuses to stop beating. And on cold nights, when travellers pass through the wasteland, they say they hear the windmill call out to them, slow and hoarse, like the dying voice of the world itself. One turn for blood, one turn for wind, one turn for memory. And if you stand there too long, they say, you'll hear your own voice whispering back, though you've never been anywhere near it in your life. The survivors of that winter said that whenever the blood windmill began to turn, they could feel the ground beneath their feet tremble like it was breathing. The sound of swirling wind, the grind of metal against metal, and the groaning of crushed souls blended into one deep resonance, like a prayer played backward. Each rotation was a long, drawn-out scream, and if you listened closely, you could hear someone whisper, "Stop." But the windmill never stopped, because the king himself wanted it to keep spinning. "Justice must have sound," he said. "And this wind is the heartbeat of the empire." From then on, the condemned were sent to push the mill, even though no one ever survived a full turn. Hands were worn to the bone, scraps of skin fell like shards of ice. Blood splattered up, clinging to the axle, staining the steel blades red and freezing instantly, preserving each drop in crystal like amber. Every drop of blood was a prayer trapped in ice. When the windmill turned for the 100th time, something strange happened. The wind no longer carried sound. It carried images. In that crimson storm, people saw figures walking against the turning blades, moving slowly through the air as if trying to escape. A young soldier assigned to guard the place claimed that in the wind he saw the face of his older brother who'd died the year before, forced to work beneath the spinning core. His brother looked at him, smiled, and then vanished into the red mist. The next day, the soldier disappeared too. Only his frozen boots remained at the edge of the rocks. Villagers began calling the place Moaning Hill, because every night the wind from the mill carried voices down from above. Not cries for help, but broken fragments of conversation, half dream, half memory. Some heard their own names, others heard children crying. A blind beggar once said that if you closed your eyes on that hill, you'd see clearer than anyone else. The wind didn't just pass through it, remembered. It carried the forms of those ground into dust, scattering them across the world. Those souls rode the wind, slipping through cracks, through doors, into dreams to whisper to whoever could still hear them. One night, when a blizzard swept across the land, the mill spun so violently that the sky turned red. The moon vanished behind the storm, leaving a single circle of light above bright as a demon's eye. The guards fled, but they could still hear singing, slow and heavy, following the rhythm of the blades. We turn, so we won't be forgotten. That song repeated, over and over, merging with the metallic scream, as if even the wind itself was mourning the souls trapped within it. By morning, when the storm was gone, the mill still stood tall. But what terrified those who returned were the footprints, hundreds, maybe thousands of small prints circling the base before disappearing into the air. There was no one left alive in the region who could have made them. The monks sent to investigate said they were the footprints of souls, and warned that anyone who followed them would be carried away forever. But curiosity always wins. One orphaned young man whose father had died pulling the windmill came to the hill one dim, moonlit night. He knelt, placed his hand on the frozen ground beneath the blades, and whispered, "Father, if you're still here, show me." The moment the words left his lips, the wind stopped. No more screeching, no more motion. The silence was so deep he could hear his own heartbeat. Then, from inside the mill, came a faint metallic knock, 1, 2, 3, like someone knocking from within. He stood, trembling, and reached for the steel blade. It was so cold his blood froze the instant he touched it, binding his hand to the surface. A faint sound followed, half laugh, half gasp, and from the core of the windmill a hand of ice reached out, brushing his neck. The hand was small, frail, but warm, an unnatural warmth that didn't belong to the living. He managed to glimpse a pair of eyes within the frost dim, but familiar the eyes of his father before everything went black. When they found him, his body was wrapped in a swirl of wind, frozen mid-air, arms spread wide, face lifted to the sky, as if helping the windmill turn one last time. From then on, the blood windmill turned slower, but heavier, each rotation groaning deeper, not like a machine anymore, but like the fading heartbeat of a giant in the dark. Those who heard it said they felt as if they were standing before a breathing grave, where every gust of wind was a prayer that would never, ever be answered. The storyteller later said that the cold in that land was no longer a phenomenon of weather. It had become a creature, something that could listen, could wait, could remember. It had no shape, no face, only the breath of snow, the cracking of ice, and the slow heartbeat of the earth. Whenever the wind passed through the winter prison, people no longer felt it blowing past them, they felt it entering them. It crawled into their chests, clung to their bones, slipped between their ribs, and rested there like a seed. On nights longer than 12 hours, the villagers swore they could hear it stir. A chill not from outside, but from within themselves. Those who had once been imprisoned there said they always felt something watching them through the long nights. Not guards, not people. The cold. It didn't see with eyes, it saw through silence. One surviving prisoner said that one night, he opened his eyes and saw the white mist on the ceiling, gathering into the shape of a hand, then melting, sliding down his throat. The chill slithered into his chest, slow and deliberate, like a snake through his heart. By morning, he felt nothing, no pain, no fear, no hunger. The cold eats emotions, he said. It doesn't kill you, it teaches you to forget. An old warden wrote it down. Here, the cold is the priest, the keeper, the coffin. Gradually, people began to believe it had memory. Anyone who entered the prison left a piece of their soul behind, like dust mixed in the ice, and the cold kept it. It didn't melt, didn't fade, didn't die. The more people perished, the stronger it grew. It learned to imitate breath, then voices, then memories. Some claimed to have heard their mother calling from within the ice, though she'd been dead for years. Others heard their child's laughter, or someone whispering their name in a familiar tone. Those who heard it never lived long, because they couldn't stop answering back. A stonemason named Bren was once sent to break down a frozen wall of the old prison. He struck it with his hammer, but every time the ice cracked, he heard a sound, not a fracture, but a sigh. He paused, leaned closer, and from within the cold came a faint voice. "Don't strike again. You're hurting me." He dropped the hammer and staggered back. He said he couldn't see anyone, but he could feel breath at his neck, weak but unmistakable. He fled. But 3 days later, they found him back there, not breaking the wall, but sitting before it, talking to it. He stayed for days, until the cold took him, freezing him in place, mouth still open as if answering someone. When guards tried to break the ice around him, the wall made a strange sound, the exact tone of his voice, repeating the same words, "I'm still here." After that, no one dared strike the walls again. They believed the cold had gained a soul, that it could keep every sound that had ever touched it. The monks called the phenomenon the white echo, the cold's reflection of human souls, not through image, but through memory. Each winter, it awoke, seeking those who could hear, whispering into their ears. Those who heard it lost sleep, lost memory, or disappeared into the snow. A young nun once stayed in the prison for 3 days to pray for the prisoners' souls. When she returned, her eyes were pale, her hair coated in frost, and her voice was no longer hers. She spoke slowly, hoarse and deep, and when asked what she'd heard, she smiled faintly and said, "They all said the same thing." "What thing?" they asked. The nun looked out the window, where snow was falling, and answered, "The cold is not the enemy. It's waiting for someone to answer." From then on, whenever the wind rose, the villagers no longer prayed for warmth. They knelt, folded their hands, and whispered to the wind as if speaking to a person. Some called them mad, but the elders said otherwise. When the cold can hear, mankind can no longer remain silent. And so, on every snow-covered night, across the white emptiness, people could still hear hundreds of voices whispering together in the wind, old and new, of the living and the dead, all blending into one endless breath, as if the world itself had never truly warmed. There was an old prisoner who had survived the longest in the dungeon, a man whom both guards and inmates regarded as a ghost among the dying. He did not speak, nor eat much. He simply sat against the wall, his eyes distant, as if they could see through the thick layers of ice to the world outside. They said he had once been a scholar, a man who could read the language of the wind. Every night he would close his eyes, breathe deeply, and whisper, "The cold is reading me." Those around him didn't understand. They only saw his lips moving in the pale mist, as if he was speaking to something unseen. Until one morning, when the warden opened the door, they found the entire cell covered in a thin layer of frost, though there were no cracks or openings anywhere. In the centre of the stone floor, the old prisoner still sat, hands resting on his knees, head slightly tilted to one side, lips curved in a faint smile. He looked asleep, but his skin had hardened, translucent like glass. His death was so strange that the guards didn't dare touch him. They only stared, until one whispered, "He's still alive. Look, his eyes, they're wet." And indeed, beneath the ice, a single droplet of water slid slowly down his cheek, catching the torchlight like a star in the dark. From that day, they called him the Preserved One, not just because his body hadn't decayed, but because something in his gaze made everyone feel he could still hear them. The rumour spread quickly. A young priest was sent to verify the tale, and upon entering the cell, he said, "I can feel warmth." But that warmth did not come from the torch in his hand, it came from the air itself. The room was breathing, and every breath seemed to carry the old man's soul. The priest gently touched the ice that encased the corpse. The moment his fingers met it, he heard a sound faint, distant, but unmistakable. "We are not killed. We are preserved." The words made him tremble and pull away, but the farther he moved, the louder the voice grew, as if the entire wall of ice were speaking at once. Hundreds, thousands of voices joined together, blending with the howling wind outside. Every block of ice, every chain, every wall carried the breath of the dead. And every breath, instead of fading, was trapped, repeating their final words again and again. "We are not killed." One of the older guards said that on quiet nights he could hear a heartbeat beneath the frozen floor, as though the earth itself were keeping someone alive. They were terrified, yet none could leave. There was something in that cold that made people addicted to it, like addicts returning to pain. Perhaps because in the cold, people felt most real, no lies, no masks, only instinct and the sound of their own heartbeat. A young prisoner once scrawled on the wall, his hand shaking, "If we are kept, then death is only a long sleep." That sentence was never erased, no matter how many times the ice melted. It was as if it had been carved into the prison's soul. From then on, the place was no longer called the winter prison. It became the chamber of preservation. The new prisoners no longer begged for death. They begged to sleep in the ice. To them, it was the only way to keep a part of themselves alive, to avoid being forgotten. A warden once asked a condemned man before his execution, "Are you afraid of death?" The man laughed hoarsely. "Afraid? No, I only fear disappearing. Here, I will never fade." Then he raised his hand, touching the frozen wall beside him as if touching his own future. When he died, they left his body leaning against the wall, and by the next morning, it had frozen solid, beautiful, like sculpture. The cold turned them into works of art, preserving every expression, every line, every flicker of fear or peace. It did not destroy, it kept, cruel yet gentle. A court painter was once invited to capture the scene. Standing in the chamber, surrounded by dozens of frozen figures, he said softly, "They are not dead. They are only waiting for spring." But spring never came. The cold went on, stretching endlessly, swallowing everything. And then someone realized the ice did not just preserve the shape of humans. It preserved their fears, their dreams, their unfinished thoughts. In each block of ice, if one stared long enough, they could see movement, a pair of eyes opening, a hand twitching, as if trying to break free. Eventually, the locals began to whisper that if the ice ever cracked, those souls would awaken, pulling the living back with them to continue their eternal sleep within a new layer of frost. And the cold, once thought to be punishment, had become something else. A tender invitation, like a lullaby for those who had nowhere left to go. At a time when people thought every form of punishment had already reached its limit, the court built something new, the Snow Echo Tower. They said it wasn't made to kill, but to listen. Yet in that listening, the pain was deeper than death itself. The tower stood in the middle of a frozen valley, round in shape, with a white stone dome, hollow inside, the walls curved inward like the belly of a massive bell. Beneath the center of the dome was a pit where the condemned were bound, surrounded by dozens of narrow pipes piercing through the walls, opening out into the snow to let the winter wind flow in. Each time the wind blew, the sound inside the tower amplified dozens of times over, echoing through the mountains. They said a single scream from within could be heard for miles, carried by the wind like a ghost's call. The king declared that the tower was built so that his people could understand the value of silence. But on the first night it was used, no one slept again. From the heart of the capital to the farthest borders, the tower's echoes spread like a mournful hymn. Every sound that entered the hollow walls was drawn out by the wind through hundreds of pipes, returning as thousands of overlapping voices, all belonging to the souls trapped within. At first came screams, then sobs, then pleas, then songs, then laughter. Some said the tower drove people mad not because of the noise, but because they heard themselves within it. One warden said that when the wind changed direction, the sound turned back toward him, and he heard the voice of his daughter, who had died the previous winter, calling him by his old father's name. He ran, screaming in terror, but the voice followed him, growing softer, softer, as if sinking into the ground. Another claimed he heard hundreds of voices at once, all calling his name. Each night, the wind carried away part of the prisoners' souls, and by morning, the guards around the tower had empty eyes, glazed over like ice, as though the wind had hollowed them out too. On the night of the full moon, the tower produced a strange sound, not human, not wind, deep, long, like a colossal instrument vibrating beneath the earth. Even those living miles away could hear it, and anyone who listened long enough shared the same dream, standing in the middle of the tower, snow falling endlessly, surrounded by hundreds of faces watching them, mouths moving soundlessly. An old priest, who had heard every sacred hymn of the court, came to the site and stood within the tower during a snowstorm. He said he wanted to understand the language of suffering. The wind blew, the walls trembled, and sound filled the chamber, swirling around his body. At first he stood firm, but then his knees buckled, hands clutching his head, his mouth spilling laughter, tears, and prayers all tangled together. The guard who witnessed it said he heard too much. When they dragged him out, he was still alive, but his eyes were no longer black, only grey, misty, as though the wind had blown the light out of them. He whispered one sentence before he died: "The scream of man and the song of the wind are the same." After that, the tower was abandoned, but no one dared destroy it, because even when it was empty, it still echoed. The wind would sweep through, and the old sounds came alive again. They tried sealing the pipes, but at night, the echoes returned. Guards swore they heard noises that did not belong to humans, whispers with no words, as if something other than the dead prisoners was singing. Some said those were the souls of the ones who had frozen to death, returned through the wind, singing for themselves. The villagers named it the Snow Echo Tower, the place where voices never die. When winter came and snow covered the valley, if one stood still, they could still hear something beneath the ground, not wind, but something deeper, older, like the frozen heartbeat of the world. A young shepherd once said that on a clear night he heard a voice carried by the wind, speaking clearly in human tongue. "We are still singing, but no one listens." Since then, the people of the valley passed down a warning: if you ever hear the tower call your name, do not answer, because even a single word in reply will make your name stay forever within the snow, and when the wind blows again, it will become a new verse in the endless song of the cold. The storyteller said, "They turned pain into music." That sentence spread in silence, like a curse. No one knew who the storyteller was. Some said he was a mad monk. Others believed he was the very soul of the winter prison itself, trying to retell its story through a human voice. But what he said was true. The powerful men of the court, after hearing the Snow Echo Tower resound during a storm, realized that the sound had a strange kind of beauty, sorrowful, horrific, yet mesmerizing. And so, they began to call it by another name: the Symphony of Death. They ordered the guards to record the stormy nights, to write down every echo, every scream, every plea, and send them to the royal composers. Those composers sat in their warm chambers, listening to the sounds of the frozen dungeon, and transcribed them into musical scores. But they didn't know that every time the instruments played, far away in the stone walls of the old prison, the ice cracked a little more. The cold refused to be turned into music because it had always been the breath of the souls themselves. A ceremony was held at the Winter Palace. The king sat upon his throne, with a curtain of white wolf fur behind him. The musicians were ordered to perform the Song of the Snow Echo Tower. The melody began slow, low, then shifted into howls, hisses, the sound of wind passing through steel pipes. The hall was packed, everyone holding their breath. Then, in the middle of the piece, another sound emerged, not from the instruments, not from any human throat. A distant echo, as if the wind itself outside was answering back. Everyone in the room shivered. The king raised an eyebrow and motioned for them to continue. But as the music reached its end, the strings began to vibrate on their own, and from beneath the icy floor, a cold mist rose. A voice, thin but clear, spoke from somewhere within the chamber. "You hear, but you do not understand. You praise, but you do not grieve." The entire hall fell silent. A young musician sitting closest to the instruments stammered, "Your Majesty." That sound didn't come from the instruments. The king stood, glancing around, but no one dared to move. Then suddenly, every candle went out. In the darkness, the wind poured in through the cracks of the doors, carrying the sounds of hundreds of people, cries, songs, voices calling out, all blending together. When the lights returned, the ice floor had split open, and at the throne, a pale mist rose like smoke. The cold had found its way back once again. After that night, The court forbade any mention of the Snow Echo Tower and banned all music inspired by it. But it was too late. Those melodies had already spread across the land, carrying with them the haunting of death. The villagers, those who once heard the tower's wind, began to play them on winter nights as a ritual. They blew flutes made of bone, struck stones, and sang words without meaning, repeating them to the rhythm of the blizzard. Some said that when they sang, the ice beneath their feet trembled as if someone below was singing back. An orphan child once said he heard his mother's voice in the song. "She told me not to cry," he said, "because down there, everyone is smiling." From then on, people no longer feared the sound of the wind. They called it the voice of those who still remembered. A young monk once wrote in his journal, "Music is born from pain. But when mankind forgets how to suffer, they will only know how to hear, not how to feel." And then, as if to prove his words, the winter prison opened its mouth again. The wind blew through the tower, through the cracks in the walls, through the frozen halls, creating strange melodies. No longer screams, but songs gentle, mournful, and so deep that no one could tell where they came from. A guard who heard it said he saw faint figures in the mist, standing together, lips moving in song. He called them the Choir of Snow. When he told the story, no one believed him until the wall he guarded burst open, and hundreds of ice blocks fell. Each one bore a face untouched, unbroken, not melting, silently singing without lungs or breath. When the moonlight struck, they glowed, forming a concert of light and wind. The souls once imprisoned no longer cried for help, they sang for themselves. And so, from within that dreadful silence, a new kind of music was born. A music with no players, no audience, no stage. It existed only between life and death, between cold and memory, between fear and release. And whoever dares to listen to it to the very end will understand that sometimes music isn't meant to be heard, but to remind us that our hearts are still beating. The guards said that on some nights, the wind carried songs, but they were only the voices of the dying. They no longer called it screaming, but the final hymn of the soul. In every gust that swept through the prison, one could hear hundreds of voices weaving together, no harmony, no rhythm, just a blur of sound suspended between silence and eternity. Some trembled, some rasped, some sounded like children sobbing, then fading into the mist. The guards who stood watch outside the gate said that at first they were terrified, but later they found themselves drawn to it. It wasn't exactly singing, more like human souls dissolving into the air itself. A man who once brought wine to the guards said that when he stopped by the outer wall, the wind struck his face, and he heard his name called in his dead mother's voice. He dropped the bottle, fell to his knees in the snow, and wept like a child, because at that moment he no longer knew what was real and what was not, only that every breath he took carried the echo of someone long gone. That cold had memory. It kept the voices of everyone who had ever breathed on that land, so that when the wind rose, they would all sing again a chorus of despair. People began calling it the ceremony of ice singing. Each night, when the sky turned white and the earth froze into silence, the wind began to sing. It started with a hiss, then a moan, then slow, drawn-out melodies, like the sound of a person being dragged between two worlds. A priest once tried to record it in writing, but he couldn't. There were no words for it. He only wrote one line: "The ice is praying." The villagers became so terrified they no longer went outside after dark. They chained their doors, and their children were made to stuff their ears with cotton before sleeping. But even behind locked doors, the song crept in like the wind slipping through cracks, whispering straight into their hearts. Some dreamed of standing inside the prison, surrounded by transparent figures fading, forming, singing wordless songs. They woke up crying, not knowing why. One night, a child went missing. They found him at the edge of the forest, sitting in the snow, eyes wide open, lips moving to a melody no one had ever heard. When they picked him up, his breath came out in white wisps, and each wisp carried the voice of an adult laughter, calling, singing. The child lived, but from that day on, he never spoke again. He only sang. Every time the wind rose, he would sing, and those who heard him fell silent, for his melody matched exactly the echo of the Snow Echo Tower, as if he were singing for the soul still trapped within. Some said the boy was a bridge between the living and the dead, chosen to carry on the memory of the winter prison. When the king heard the story, he ordered the boy brought to the palace. Standing before the throne, the child kept singing unceasing, unstoppable, until the furious king commanded his mouth be bound with cold cloth. But as the fabric wrapped around him, a violent wind roared outside. The windows shattered, and a storm surged into the hall, sweeping away candles and men alike. When it was over, the boy was gone. Only the strip of cloth remained, tangled on the throne, quivering as if still singing the unfinished melody. From that night on, no one dared hold music ceremonies during winter. Even without musicians, without instruments, strange sounds could still be heard on snowy nights. Some swore they saw pale blue pillars of light rise from the frozen plains, moving like dancers. Each step made the ice crack, marking the rhythm of a ghostly waltz. The wind became the orchestra, the snow its stage, and the forgotten souls the performers. No one knew why death could sing, but everyone who heard it remembered forever. An old hunter once said, "If you ever hear the wind begin to sing, don't sing back, because if you do, you'll never know silence again." But others came not out of fear, but longing. They believed their loved ones' voices were among those in the wind. They stood in the snowfields, lifted their heads, closed their eyes, and let the wind pass through them. In that moment, all pain, guilt, and memory seemed to dissolve into the song, leaving behind a tender emptiness, sorrowful yet peaceful. The cold and the sound merged once more, creating a song without end where the living and the dead sang together, without rhythm, without words, only with their existence. The old executioner, who had witnessed hundreds die in the ice, once said there were nights when he heard them singing his name. At first he laughed it off, thinking it was the delusion of age, but over time the voices grew clearer, closer, as if someone were whispering right beside his ear. He began to lose sleep. His eyes sank deep into their sockets. His hands trembled when he lifted the hammer. Each time the snow fell, he heard the old voices again. The voice of the woman burned as a witch, the thief who stole bread, the children accused of defiling an altar. They all spoke the same words. "Do you remember?" At first, he hid from it, drank, covered his ears, tried not to listen. But the song no longer came from outside, it came from within, from his chest. It was as if the ice had crawled into his lungs, so that every breath he exhaled carried the voices of the dead. One night, he looked in the mirror and saw that the frost on his skin was thicker than the snow outside. Steam rose from his mouth like smoke, and in that smoke, faces appeared. Children, women, soldiers, all looking at him, neither angry nor forgiving, only silent. Yet it was that silence that terrified him more than any curse. He tried to forget, but memory would not allow it. Every hammer strike, every chain pulled tight, every scream echoed back, blending into a dreadful symphony that never stopped. He began hearing it even on clear days. The guards saw him sitting for hours by the ice wall, muttering along, as if trying to learn the song. Then one day, they saw him smile. Not with joy, but the hollow smile of a man who had gone mad. He said he finally understood the song, that it did not belong to the dead, but to the souls left behind. "They don't hate me," he whispered. "They just want me to listen until the end." That night, he walked into the prison alone, carrying no torch, only a rope, and the song still echoing from afar. When the guards found him the next morning, he was hanging from an ice pillar in the courtyard. Beneath his feet, the snow was stained red, but strangely, the ice around him was clearer than ever. The rope at his neck had frozen solid, and the wind was still singing now in his voice. They said that for several nights after, his tone blended with the wind hoarse, slow, like a man reciting a prayer. A young priest came to bless the body, but refused to perform the rite in the courtyard, saying, "He's not gone." When asked why, he pointed to the ice pillar where a dark streak ran down its length, shaped like a man forever falling. The guards later claimed that sometimes the pillar shook, even when there was no wind, and that they heard breathing inside, faint, laboured, but real. Though his name was forbidden to be spoken, everyone knew that night had changed the prison. The cold grew so thick that candles would not burn. Some swore that when they crossed the yard, they saw a figure hanging in mid-air, facing the snow echo tower. Moonlight through the fog formed a halo around that body, making it sway gently to an invisible song. Some said he never died. that the rope was merely his path into the wind, so his final song could remain forever. And indeed, since that night, whenever a storm came, the wind in the prison changed its tone deeper, heavier, like an old man's voice telling a story. Those who heard it said they could make out his murmurs, every name, every sin, every sentence, every breath. No one dared respond, because they knew he was confessing to the very souls he had once executed. Once, a young guard asked an older one if he pitied the old executioner. The old man replied, "No, he's just singing the rest of the song we were never brave enough to finish." And so, in the long nights that followed, everyone could hear the faint creak of rope, as if the ice pillar were still swaying. And each sunrise, the snow around it seemed smoother, softer, as if someone had brushed away the fear with a gentle hand. The elders in the village said that sometimes a soul doesn't vanish. It simply chooses another form to exist as wind, as ice, or as an unfinished story. And among the place where every scream had turned into music, one hoarse voice still whispered through the falling snow, "I have heard, I have remembered, and now I only wish for silence." That spring came later than any other year. No one knew why, but the snow still hadn't melted, and the wind still blew as if winter refused to leave. Then one morning, sunlight fell upon the old fortress, and the ground shimmered with light. When people came closer, they realized what glimmered beneath the ice wasn't stone, it was people. Hundreds, thousands of bodies, clear as crystal, stacked upon one another, each face perfectly preserved, each pair of eyes still open, gleaming as though just awakening. Those who had been executed, the forgotten, the nameless souls all now lay still together in the light. Some said it was the most beautiful and terrifying sight they had ever seen. Sunlight passed through the ice, scattering colours across the snow like the stained glass of a cathedral. The wind swept over them, letting out a long, low hum that sounded like breathing. Villagers gathered. Some knelt and prayed. Others, frightened, threw stones at the ice, but each stone bounced back, leaving no mark, as if what they saw didn't quite belong to this world. An old woman trembled and said, "They're not dead. They're just waiting to be called by name." No one dared to answer. That night, no one in the village slept. Light from the frozen ground reflected on their ceilings, drifting like floating flames. People said if you stared long enough, you could see the figures inside the ice move slightly, their lips parting, as though singing the song of the wind. A child asked his father, "Dad, do they hurt?" The father said nothing, just held his son tight, because in the wind he heard someone whisper back, "No, we're only cold." A few days later, the ice began to melt. Water trickled into streams, blending with old blood, leaving faint red trails across the snow. No one dared to touch it. They only watched as the bodies slowly faded into mist. Yet strangely, as the ice touched the ground and vanished, there was no sound of breaking. They disappeared softly like the final breath of someone falling asleep. Only the faint hum of wind remained, gentle as a farewell. Years later, the storyteller returned to the prison. What was once a dark pit had half collapsed. Inside, the walls were cracked and stained, but on one surviving slab of stone, there were words carved deep and trembling. Not everyone died for their sins. Some died for the winter. He stood silently for a long time. His hand brushed the cold letters. It felt like touching a wound that history hadn't yet healed. The carvings were uneven, shallow in places, deep in others, but each stroke was a human voice. Small, fragile, heartbreakingly real. He realized then that perhaps the cold had never been punishment. It was a mirror, reflecting every ounce of cruelty, greed, and indifference in mankind. They were the ones who built the prison, who made the wind, who forged the ice, and they were the ones trapped inside what they thought was justice. The cold hadn't killed anyone. It had kept them. It kept the cries, the memories, the eyes that never closed. It kept fear and compassion alike, so that those who came after could look into it and see themselves. He lifted his gaze, his breath turning to mist, and for the first time he heard the wind no longer howling, but sighing softly, sadly, like an old man telling a story. He stepped outside. The snow had stopped falling. Moonlight reflected on the ground, forming a faint, endless path of ice. He followed it, each step cracking softly beneath him, like doors creaking open to see him off. At the end of the slope, the wind blew again, a gentle gust brushing his shoulder, tender and cool as a hand's touch. He smiled and whispered, "I have heard, I have seen, and I will tell it." The story ended there, not with a cry, not with fear, but with stillness. Because perhaps, after all the winters, the prisons, the tortures, the songs of souls, only one truth remained. Humans have always wanted to be heard, even just once more. And if one night, in the quiet of the wind, you feel a chill slip through the door, don't rush to close it. Sit still. Close your eyes. Listen closely. Perhaps it isn't the wind at all, but the voice of someone, a soul who once longed to be warm, just one last time, before fading into the breath of the world. If you're still listening now, it means your heart is still beating in rhythm with the story. Hit subscribe to stay with me in the nights to come, where the cold mysteries are still waiting to be unveiled. And now, close your eyes, let the warmth of sleep embrace you. Good night, and don't forget winter is still continuing.